23,000 feet above New York Harbor, the city below is a ghost of itself. The lights blur at that altitude. The noise stopped reaching hours ago. On a clear October evening in 2013, the island of Attilan drifts in the high, cold air like a thought that has never been spoken aloud, which, in many ways, is exactly what it is. Inside the throne room, Blackagar Boltagon stands alone. He is a man of medium height, with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that have learned to say everything a voice would ruin. He has been king for longer than most nations have had their current borders. He has governed a civilization of thousands without once addressing them directly. His court has learned to read the angle of his jaw, the set of his hands, the particular quality of stillness that separates agreement from refusal. He has not raised his voice in the presence of another living soul in 34 years. Across the throne room, Thanos waits. The Titan has come to Attilan with a demand that is not really a demand. It is a verdict. He has sent word ahead through his Lieutenant Corvus Glaive. Deliver the heads of all Inhuman youth between the ages of 16 and 22, and Attilan will be permitted to go on floating. Refuse, and the history of the oldest city on Earth will end on a Tuesday in autumn. He stands in the stone-cold light of the throne room now, enormous and unhurried, and he looks at the silent king, and he sees what most people see. A ruler who will not speak, a passive man, a cipher who has spent his entire reign in restraint, and therefore has nothing left to use. He's about to learn what restraint actually is, how the most dangerous voice in the universe came to be aimed, like a carefully calibrated instrument, at the most dangerous mind in creation, and what it cost the man who finally opened his mouth starts roughly 25,000 years before either of them existed. The Kree did not build the Inhumans. They built an experiment. The distinction mattered to them in the beginning, when the project was still new, when the scientists aboard the Kree research fleet were still certain they could control what they had started. They were wrong, not immediately, not in any single catastrophic way, but gradually, over centuries, in the way that all things escape the hands that shape them. 25,000 years ago, the Kree Empire was locked in a war with the Skrulls that had already lasted longer than human civilization would eventually run. The Skrulls were shapeshifters, infiltrators, masters of biological disguise, and the Kree had spent generations developing technology to counter them, only to discover that technology was never quite enough. What the Kree Supreme Intelligence concluded, after running the calculations through the full depth of its composite consciousness, was that the Kree themselves had hit a genetic ceiling. Their species had reached the boundary of its evolutionary potential. Further development through their own biology alone was not coming. The answer, if there was one, would have to come from somewhere else. They found that somewhere else on a small world in the Sol system, the genetic archives preserved on Hala and catalogued in detail across the Kree Suprema's early expedition reports, describe Earth's primitive humanoid population as unexpectedly remarkable at the chromosomal level. Where most species in this sector of the galaxy had developed along stable, predictable evolutionary lines, early humans carried something the Kree scientists had never encountered in quite this configuration. Enormous latent potential, coiled into the genome like a spring, waiting for the right trigger. The Celestials had been at work on human DNA centuries before the Kree arrived, engineering a genetic inheritance that made humanity malleable in ways that defied easy categorization. The Kree, examining these findings, saw what they believed was an opportunity. They established a research station on Earth and began their work. The precise number of human subjects involved in the initial experimental phase has never been definitively established, though Kree military records recovered and translated by Reed Richards in his Baxter Building archives suggest the program involved somewhere between 100 and 400 individuals over the course of several decades. The scientists used a compound derived from a rare mineral extracted from the volcanic rock of the region, a substance they classified as Terrigen, and would later refine into the mutagenic catalyst known as the Terrigen Mists. Exposure to the mists triggered controlled genetic mutation in the human subjects, unlocking the latent potential the Kree had identified and expressing it as specific physical or psionic abilities. Some subjects developed enhanced strength, others developed the ability to project energy. Still others changed in ways that had no direct military application, becoming something the Kree scientists catalogued as biological curiosities rather than soldiers. The Kree called the program Project Chimera in some records and unnamed in others, as if the fleet's commanding officers could not agree on whether to acknowledge it formally. What they all agreed on, for roughly the first century of the experiment, was that it was working. The mutations they produced were stable, heritable, and remarkable. The subjects they created were, in many measurable respects, superior to baseline humans in the same way that a refined instrument is superior to the raw material it is shaped from. The Kree believed they were building a warrior class that would serve them in the long conflict with the Skrulls, a race of living weapons who would be loyal because they had been made by the Empire and had nowhere else to belong. What they actually built was something they had not planned for. The modifications compounded across generations in ways the Kree's initial models had not predicted. The second generation of Terrigen-exposed humans was more mutated than the first. The third generation showed entirely new expressions of the compound mutation, variations that had not been observed in the parent population. The Terrigen trigger, combined with the celestial engineered genome, was doing something the Kree scientists had not designed. It was evolving. Not randomly, not chaotically, but purposefully, the way complex systems sometimes do when the initial conditions are rich enough. The research station was no longer producing soldiers, it was producing a people. The Kree Supreme Intelligence received a report sometime in the 3rd century of the program that stopped the entire operation. The specifics of that report have never been fully recovered, but its conclusion is documented in the Inhuman Genetics Council records described in the 1998 Inhumans series by Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee. The Supreme Intelligence had received what it classified as a predictive analysis from its precognitive modelling systems, and the analysis said, in terms that admitted no comfortable interpretation, that the race the Kree were creating would one day be instrumental in the destruction of the Kree Empire. The beings emerging from Project Chimera were not going to be loyal weapons. They were going to be something the Empire could not contain. The program was terminated. The research station was abandoned. The scientists returned to Hala and filed their reports, and the Kree turned their attention back to the Skrull War and tried to forget what they had left behind on a blue-green world in an unremarkable solar system. They left behind approximately 1,000 individuals who had already undergone full terrigenesis and several thousand more who carried the latent modification in their genome without yet having been exposed to the mists. These people had no Kree fleet to serve, no master race to answer to, and no clear identity other than what they built for themselves. They had the compound genetic modification in their blood, the memory of the Terrigen process in their cells, and the capacity to pass both to their children. They had a world that did not fully understand them. They built a city. Attilan stands in the historical record as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. The Inhuman records claim a founding date that predates the earliest known human agricultural settlements by several thousand years. In its early centuries, the city was located somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, on a landmass that would later be partly submerged as sea levels changed. The Inhumans built it with the same meticulous genetic discipline that the Kree had instilled in them. Every structure planned, every population decision considered, every generation carefully monitored for the expression of Terrigen-influenced mutations. They had been made by scientists. They became, in their own culture, scientists of themselves. The Terrigen Mists became the centerpiece of Inhuman civilization in a way that the Kree had never intended. Where the Kree had used terrigenesis as a manufacturing process, producing desired mutations on demand, the Inhumans transformed it into something closer to a rite of passage. Every Inhuman child at a designated age would enter the mists and undergo their own terrigenesis, emerging as something changed. The change was unpredictable. The mist did not read requests or follow instructions. They amplified whatever was already there, which meant that a child born to warriors might emerge as a healer. A child born to scientist might emerge with a power that had no scientific application whatsoever, and occasionally, rarely, a child might emerge having barely changed at all. What emerged from the mists determined your place. This is the fact about Inhuman civilization, that the history tends to mention briefly and move past, but which shaped everything, including the life of every king Attilan ever had. The result of your terrigenesis was your social position. Those who emerged with powers considered valuable to the city, to the military, to the scientific infrastructure rose in status. Those who emerged changed in ways deemed less useful occupied a middle tier, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, performing the essential labour that kept Attilan functioning, were the alpha primitives, the members of the inhuman population whose terrigenesis had not produced discrete powers, but had instead, in the crueler phrasing of the Genetics Council, reduced their cognitive complexity to functional minimum. The Inhumans built a magnificent civilization on the backs of people they had, in the name of genetic science, made unable to object to their own condition. This fact about them will matter later. The Genetics Council, a body of senior scientists and elders, governed the terrigenesis schedule, approved genetic pairings, monitored the expression of mutation across generations, and advised the king. They were not a parliament. They did not govern by popular consensus. They governed by the application of what they called genetic wisdom, which was the conviction that the long history of the inhuman people was best understood through the record of which mutations had proven beneficial over time, and that the best decisions for the civilization's future were decisions made by the people who kept those records. They were, in their own estimation, the custodians of what the Kree had begun and what the Inhumans had refined. They were proud of what they had built. They were also, in a way that would only become clear much later, afraid of what they had built. The predictive analysis that had sent the Kree fleeing had not been wrong. What the Kree had created on Earth was not a weapon in the sense they understood weapons. It was something more dangerous, a people with the genetic potential to become anything the circumstances required. The Kree had abandoned the project because they feared what the Inhumans would become. The Inhumans, left to their own devices, had become exactly that thing, not a weapon for the Kree, not a subject race for anyone, something the universe had not quite had before. For 25,000 years they developed in isolation. They moved Attilan when the world encroached, when humans began sailing the oceans, when the risk of discovery outweighed the advantage of staying. They moved from the Atlantic to the Himalayas, built new walls in thinner air, continued their science and their culture and their careful, documented progress. They endured Maximus's first coups. They survived contact with the wider universe. They persisted through wars, through invasions, through the indignity of kings being replaced by Skrull imposters, through everything the Kree's prophecy had implied was coming. And in all that time, in all those centuries of genetic monitoring and Terrigen scheduling and careful council decisions, nothing the Genetics Council produced frightened them the way a single birth did. Not a battle, not an invasion. A child, born to their king, within their walls, carrying in his lungs a capacity for sound that the Kree would have recognized as the fulfillment of everything their supreme intelligence had predicted. The first indication that Blackagar Boltagon was going to be different came before he was born. It came, specifically, before he was ready to come at all, in a laboratory accident in the genetic research wing of the Royal Palace, on a quiet afternoon when the air above Attilan was still, and the rest of the city was carrying on with its business, and a woman named Rinda, who was 7 months pregnant with the heir to the Inhuman throne, walked into a corridor where a canister of experimental Terrigen compound had been venting for an unknown amount of time. She did not know she'd been exposed until later. By then, the mutation had already begun in the child she carried. By then, it was already too late to do anything except wait and watch and prepare for what was coming, and try to understand what the Genetics Council's most sensitive instruments were telling them about the nature of the power already taking shape in the unborn boy's developing nervous system. What came next was the story of a king. But first it was the story of a child who learned, at the earliest possible age, that what lived inside him was not something the world could safely receive. The silence was not a punishment. It was not a diagnosis. It was a discipline, chosen and maintained for everyone else's sake, and it started before he ever drew his first breath in the cold, careful air of Attilan. It would not end for 34 years, and when it ended, the world would remember it. But that moment is a long way from here. For now the city floats, the Genetics Council files their records, the Terrigen Mists wait in their chambers for the next generation to enter. And in the royal palace, a king and his wife prepare for the birth of a child who will spend his entire life trying not to be what the Kree designed him to be, and will succeed, and in the end, precisely because he succeeded for so long, will do more damage with a single moment of failure than any other being of his generation. Aegon, king of the Inhumans and senior geneticist of the Genetics Council, had been working for 11 years on a theory about accelerated terrigenesis. The standard process required a child to reach a certain threshold of physical and neurological development before the mists could produce stable results. Premature exposure carried risks, incomplete mutation, unstable expression, outcomes the Council classified as unfortunate. Aegon believed the threshold could be moved. He believed that with the right preparation, the right Terrigen compound in the right concentration, the genetic potential the mists were designed to unlock could be reached earlier, more completely, and with more predictable expression. He had been testing variations of the Terrigen compound in the lower laboratory, documenting the results, and building toward a protocol that might change the inhuman terrigenesis process entirely. On the afternoon that Rinda walked through the corridor near Laboratory 7, 3 tanks of Aegon's experimental compound had been venting through a cracked valve for approximately 40 minutes. The air in that corridor smelled faintly of something mineral and cold, the way deep volcanic rock smells when it is split open, a smell that Attilan's inhuman residents associated with the formal terrigenesis chambers and therefore rarely registered as alarming. Rinda was 7 months pregnant. She was not alarmed. She walked through the corridor, continued to her destination, and thought nothing further about it until Aegon's instruments, recalibrated the following week, showed an anomaly in the genetic profile of the child she was carrying. The child had undergone terrigenesis in utero. Not partial terrigenesis, not a preliminary expression of the process, but the complete activation. The mists, or rather Aegon's accelerated experimental variant of them, had reached the developing child through the most intimate possible transmission and had done exactly what they were designed to do: find the latent potential in the genome and unlock it. The Genetics Council's records, preserved in the documentation that Paul Jenkins drew on extensively for his 1998 Inhumans series, described the initial analysis as producing results the scanning instruments were not designed to read. The child's developing nervous system was generating a pattern of quasi-sonic energy unlike anything the Inhuman database had seen. Not power in the abstract. Power specifically concentrated in the anatomy of voice, in the developing larynx and the resonating structures surrounding it, in the neural pathways that control voluntary and involuntary sound production. The child in the womb was already, before birth, generating energy at a level that would have been classified as a hazardous condition in an adult. Aegon ran the analysis 11 times. He got the same result 11 times. He then called a private session of the Genetics Council and presented his findings, and the council spent 4 hours discussing what to do with information that had no precedent in the full 25,000-year history of inhuman medicine. There was a proposal to induce early delivery and begin containment immediately. There was a counter-proposal that the child be allowed to develop fully before any intervention, on the grounds that the in-utero exposure might have interfered with other developmental processes and that preemptive action could make things worse. The discussion went in circles for a long time, as Genetics Council discussions tended to do, until Aegon set down his notes and told the room, with the particular quietness of a man who has stopped arguing and started deciding, that the child would be born naturally, that containment would be prepared and ready, and that no one outside this room would know about the quasi-sonic anomaly until there was something useful to say about it. Blackagar Boltagon was born in the early morning, several weeks before his expected delivery date. The birth was attended by Aegon, Rinda, 2 senior medical geneticists and no one else. The room was prepared. Thick materials, dampening composites, everything the council's engineers had been able to assemble in the weeks since Aegon's announcement. The preparation was almost enough. Almost. His first sound, not a cry in the true sense, more the involuntary vocalization of a newly breathing body, the reflex that opens new lungs, lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, every instrument in the delivery suite cracked. The reinforced observation window developed a fracture pattern that began at the centre and spread to all 4 corners. The elder geneticist closest to the child fell unconscious. Aegon, standing furthest from the infant, kept his feet but lost the hearing in his left ear for 6 days. Rinda, who was closest of all, was unharmed only because Aegon had positioned her behind 3 layers of the dampening composite and had calculated correctly that the initial reflex vocalization would be lateral rather than directly vertical. They placed the infant in the containment chamber that had been prepared in the lower levels of the genetics laboratory. The chamber was a sealed environment, the walls composite materials of unusual density and construction, the viewing window a specialized glass that was, in practice, almost opaque. The air filtration systems were designed to manage the specific energy signature the infant's voice produced. The chamber was comfortable, or as comfortable as a sealed room could be. Temperature controlled, well lit, provisioned with the objects and stimulations appropriate to a growing child, but it was sealed. Blackagar Boltagon spent his first months of life in a room where no other person was present, where comfort arrived through mechanisms rather than through held hands, where the sounds of his world were filtered and managed and carefully monitored. Aegon visited every day through the viewing window. He developed a way of communicating, formal gesture, deliberate expression, the careful vocabulary of a father who could not hold his son and knew it, and was going to make the alternative as rich as he possibly could. The medical team added educational materials through the provision systems as the child grew. Visual instruction, symbol recognition, the fundamentals of the Inhuman written language. Brynda came less often than Aegon, not from lack of love, but from a kind of grief that made the visits difficult for her in ways she could not fully articulate and did not try to. She came, but the glass between them cost her something each time. What the boy in the chamber developed, across those years, was a quality that would define him more completely than any political title or any act of war. He learned to be still. Not still in the way of someone who's been told to be still, who is containing movement with effort. Still in the way of deep water, which does not move because nothing in its nature requires it to. He sat in his chamber, and he watched the world through thick glass, and he developed, with the methodical patience of a child who has nothing else available to him, a complete literacy of the human face. He could read his father's mood before Aegon had finished positioning himself at the window. He could distinguish between the 12 varieties of the medical team's professional concern. He mapped expressions the way another child might map a city, cataloguing, memorizing, finding the roots between one state and another. He learned sign language with a facility that astonished the educators, partly because he had more time than most children to practice, and partly because, without a voice, he understood at a cellular level that the hands were all he had. He developed his own extensions of the formal Inhuman sign language, finer distinctions, subtle variations in hand position that expressed nuances the base vocabulary did not cover. By the time he was 12, he could conduct a complex political argument entirely through facial expression and gesture, a fact that made the Genetics Council deeply uncomfortable, because a boy who could do that at 12 was going to be capable of something considerably more sophisticated at 20. His education covered the full range of what the Genetics Council considered appropriate for a child of royal blood. The history of the Inhumans from the Kree experiments forward, the political structure of Attilan, the theoretical underpinnings of Terrigen genetics, strategic philosophy, the documented histories of the royal lineage, and the ongoing record of relations between Attilan and the increasingly populated world outside its walls. He read everything the provision system sent him. He had, by most accounts, absorbed more of the Inhuman historical record by age 15 than most members of the Genetics Council had at the point of their appointments. What his education could not give him was the thing that childhood is most essentially built from, the ordinary friction of other people. He had no peers, he had no rivals, he had no friendships conducted in the mess of real proximity, where people interrupt each other and disagree and change their minds and sometimes say things they immediately regret. He had observation through glass, and he had books, and he had a father who loved him and visited every day and had no way to give him what the glass prevented. What this produced was something that looked, from the outside, like exceptional composure. What it actually was a man who had learned to do everything internally, because the external was not available to him. Every conflict was private, every uncertainty was handled alone, every grief was carried in silence, because silence was the only environment he had ever known. He was removed from the chamber gradually, beginning around his 16th year, as the Genetics Council determined that his control over the quasi-sonic ability had reached a threshold they classified as minimally safe. Minimally safe meant he could, with sustained effort, suppress the energy generation to a level where it posed no immediate hazard to the people around him, provided those people maintained a certain distance, provided the environment was not extremely loud, provided he did not experience strong involuntary emotion. These were significant provisos. The Council noted them in their reports, and authorized limited, supervised exposure to the rest of Attilan anyway, because the alternative was keeping the heir to the throne in a sealed room indefinitely, and the political implications of that had become impossible to continue ignoring. His first extended contact with Attilan was, by multiple accounts in the Council's medical records, almost silent. He walked through the city with 2 attendants at a fixed distance, and he looked at everything. The architecture he had studied in books was different when he was standing in it. The Alpha Primitives, whom he had read about as a social category, were different when they were walking past him carrying loads and meeting his eyes briefly and then looking away. The city was, as advertised, magnificent, built to last, designed with a genetic precision that showed in every proportioned corridor and every carefully considered public space. It was also, he saw immediately, built around a hierarchy that the books had described, but that the books had not, somehow, fully conveyed. He came back from that first extended exposure with his face arranged in the particular careful neutrality that the Genetics Council had come to understand meant he was processing something he was not going to address in the immediate term. The medical team's report from that day notes, in the clinical phrasing of people who are trying to be precise without being alarming, that the king apparent appeared to have formed several strong opinions. It does not specify what those opinions were. It did not need to. The Genetics Council had been watching this child develop in a sealed room for 16 years. They had built his understanding of Attilan with every document they chose to send through the provision system, and every document they chose not to send. They had made him, and now he had walked through the city they had built and formed strong opinions about it, and no one in the room could quite read what those opinions were, because he had also, in 16 years of sealed silence, become completely unreadable when he chose to be. That was the child. The king came later, faster, and through a circumstance no one planned for, which is almost always how kings come. The chamber was behind him, the glass was behind him. The isolated years of careful observation were, as it turned out, the best possible preparation for a life in which every decision would have to be made without the luxury of asking for more time, and in which the quality of his attention to people's faces would be the primary instrument through which he governed an entire civilization. His brother was already waiting. Maximus had been waiting in his particular way since before Blackagar had been old enough to understand what waiting meant. And the Kree ship was already there too, circling in the high air above Attilan, watching, deciding, beginning the sequence of events that would end with one young man in the cold and the other changed in a way that could never be undone. The silence by the time it mattered was 34 years deep, but before that it was 20 years of practice, and before that it was a child sitting in a sealed room, watching the world through thick glass, learning everything he could about what people were like from the outside, because the inside was not an option that had been offered to him. The Kree did not stay gone. The Kree Supreme Intelligence had made a calculation and terminated a program, but the Kree military machine does not terminate its interest in strategically useful assets simply because a political decision is made at the highest level. Individual officers continue to collect intelligence. Individual fleets continue to monitor systems of interest. And a world where a race of genetically enhanced warriors had been left behind, a world the Supreme Intelligence had specifically flagged as a source of existential risk, remained on the monitoring list of the Kree fleet's outer patrol routes for every year of the 25,000 years that followed the program's formal end. They were watching. They had always been watching. Blackagar was 19 years old or thereabouts when the Kree ship appeared in the high air above Attilan. He had been out of the containment chamber for 3 years by then, supervised at first, gradually less so, learning the city and the court and the complex social grammar of a civilization that had been building its hierarchies and its resentments and its formal protocols since long before his parents were born. He was still learning. He was specifically still learning his brother. Maximus Boltagon was 2 years younger and radically different from Blackagar in every visible way. Where Blackagar was still, Maximus was in motion. Where Blackagar communicated in careful gesture and precise expression, Maximus talked. Fluently, persuasively, with the easy charm of someone who had been born with the social facility that his brother had to work for. He was brilliant in the specific way that made people in rooms want to agree with him, which is a form of brilliance more useful than raw intelligence, and more dangerous than most people recognize when they are experiencing it. He was also, though this was not yet fully visible to anyone who was not paying very close attention, deeply envious, not of the title, not primarily, of the certainty. Blackagar had been, from birth, completely clear about what he was and what his position required of him. Maximus had never had that clarity. He had a voice and a mind and enormous capability, and no obvious place where those things fit together into a destiny. The envy curdled in him quietly, below the charm mostly invisible until the day it wasn't. On the night the Kree ship was detected in the upper atmosphere, Maximus made a choice. The choice has been reconstructed from the aftermath rather than observed directly, but the Genetics Council's post-incident analysis and the account synthesized across multiple Inhuman historical sources, including the 1998 Jenkins series and the later Silent War arc by David Hine, converges on a consistent picture. Maximus had been in contact with the Kree observation post, not in the formal diplomatic sense, in the private sense of a young man who decided that the world outside Attilan's walls might offer him what the world inside had withheld. He had, through means that the historical record is deliberately vague about, initiated communication with the Kree officers aboard the vessel. What he had offered them in exchange for what he wanted is not recorded. What the Kree had offered him is not recorded either. What is recorded is that when the ship positioned itself to conduct what appeared to be a deep scan of Attilan's structural records, Maximus was inside the palace and Blackagar was outside it. Blackagar saw the ship. He had excellent distance vision, better than the average Inhuman, a product of the years spent observing through glass. He saw the configuration, the characteristic hull design of a Kree military observation vessel, and he understood in approximately 3 seconds what it meant. It meant that the Kree had come back. It meant that his people did not know. It meant that someone had to warn them, and he was outside, and the warning systems required a human voice to activate. And the most effective warning he had available to him was the one he spent every waking hour of his life trying not to use. He made a choice. He made it quickly, which is the only way some choices can be made, and it was not a wrong choice in any straightforward analysis of the situation. He turned toward the ship. He exhaled. He whispered. The word, if it was a word at all in the conventional sense, is not documented anywhere in the Inhuman record in a form that helps clarify what he intended. What is documented is the effect. The quasi-sonic energy released even by a whisper, controlled to the minimum possible expression of his ability, struck the Kree observation vessel with a force equivalent to what the Council's engineers later estimated as a small warhead. The ship's hull held for approximately 4 seconds after impact. Then it did not. The vessel broke apart in the high, cold air, and the debris field spread across several kilometers of ocean below Attilan. And the crew of the ship, some portion of whom were Kree officers who had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of a protected population, did not survive. The wave that destroyed the Kree ship continued past the point of impact. Quasi-sonic energy does not stop when it finishes its first task. It travels. And it travelled through the upper air above Attilan and into the palace, and in the eastern wing of the palace, in the corridor outside the communications centre, it found Maximus. The effect on Maximus was not what the effect on the Kree ship had been. The ship was an object. Maximus was a person, specifically a person with latent psionic capabilities that the Genetics Council had already identified and was monitoring. The quasi-sonic wave struck him the way a strong current strikes something that was already in the water. It did not destroy him, but it changed the direction and the nature of everything that was moving in him. The neural connection between his rational processes and the psionic potential the Council had been watching became, in the moment of the impact, permanently disrupted. Not severed. Disrupted. The psionic capability remained and in some ways became more accessible, more powerful, easier to use. What the disruption cost was the stable architecture around it. The brilliant, charming young man who had been talking to Kree officers outside official channels would go on to become, over the years that followed, a figure known to the Inhuman court and to the wider Marvel universe as Maximus the Mad. Still brilliant, still capable of extraordinary insight, profoundly unstable in ways that expressed differently in different years but never resolved. The Genetics Council convened within hours of the incident. Not all of the Council's deliberations in that session are part of the historical record. What is documented is that the session lasted 9 hours, that multiple proposals were raised and rejected, that there was at least one strongly contested vote, and that the session ended with a set of decisions that changed the course of Inhuman history in ways the Council members probably did not fully anticipate when they made them. The first decision was that Blackagar would not be punished for the destruction of the Kree vessel. The Kree had been conducting unauthorized surveillance in violation of agreements that the Kree Empire would claim, if confronted, it had never made. The second decision was that Maximus's condition would be classified as an internal medical matter and would not be disclosed to the wider court as having a specific cause. The third decision was the one that mattered most. Blackagar Boltagon would assume the throne immediately. Aegon and Rinda died within weeks of that session. The circumstances are documented differently in different accounts. Some say the stress and shock of the incident. Some say there were related injuries from the aftermath of the Kree ship's destruction that proved fatal. Some simply note that the king and queen died of causes the council classified as natural. What all the accounts agree on is the timeline. Blackagar became king at 19, with grief he could not express in the conventional way, in a situation that had no conventional resolution, surrounded by a court that was watching him very carefully to see what he was going to do. He did not speak. He stood in the throne room for the first time as its rightful occupant, with the marks of the chamber years still in the way he held himself, and he looked at the assembled court, and he did not speak. He had done enough with his voice for 1 week. He had done enough with his voice, possibly for a very long time. The court had been expecting, some of them, a proclamation, a declaration of intent, the formal assumption of power that tradition required. They got instead a king who stood at the front of the room and looked at them with eyes that had spent 3 years reading the city, and a lifetime reading faces through glass, and who communicated through the absolute precision of his stillness that he was paying attention to all of them, had been paying attention to all of them, and intended to continue. It was not what the Genetics Council had expected from him. They had decided in the long session after the Kree incident that a silent king could be managed. A silent king would need them. A silent king would depend on their counsel and their interpretation and their authority in ways that a king who could simply announce his decisions to the room would not. A silent king, they had calculated, was a useful king from the perspective of an advisory body that had been the real centre of Inhuman governance for centuries. They were correct in their assessment of his dependency. They were substantially wrong about what that dependency would look like in practice. He made them work for every piece of information they wanted from him. The facial vocabulary he had spent his containment years developing was precise enough to convey nuance but deliberately arranged in his dealings with the council, so that the nuance required the observers to commit to an interpretation before they could act on it, and if the interpretation turned out to be wrong, the error was theirs and not his. The council found themselves in the position of reading a text that revealed its meaning slowly, and not always in the direction they had expected. The silent king, it became clear in the first year of his reign, was not a passive king. He was a king whose passivity was itself a form of governance, one that kept his intentions opaque, and his decisions his own until the moment of implementation. His brother watched all of this from a position that was no longer what it had been before the wave. Maximus functioned. He was present at court, he participated in proceedings, he was charming and eloquent and capable of extended periods of behaviour that looked completely normal to people who had not known him before. But the disruption was there, visible to those who were paying close attention. Moments of distraction that came from nowhere and resolved without explanation, enthusiasms that rose too quickly and fell too hard, a pattern of focusing on specific individuals that had the quality of fixation rather than simple interest. The court adapted, as courts always adapt, by building its formal processes around the fact of him, without directly naming the fact of him. Black Bolt watched his brother with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that concerned him deeply, without visible expression, with complete continuity, without blinking at the wrong moment. He knew what had happened. He had not caused it with malice. He had not caused it through negligence exactly, because the alternative was letting the Kree observe Attilan without responding. But he had caused it. The sound that had saved his people from a Kree intelligence operation had broken the mind of the only family he had left. The reframe was always there, if he chose to reach for it. He had not been wrong to act. The Kree were a genuine threat. The warning was necessary. He did not choose to reach for the reframe. He held the fact of it plainly, the way he held everything, without looking away. His brother was changed. His voice had changed him. The discipline he maintained for every waking hour of his life after that was not only about protecting the people around him from the physical force of his power, it was about the knowledge of what carelessness, even well-intentioned carelessness, cost. The silence after the sound was not just habit, it was a choice made every morning, renewed every hour, every minute, in every room where other people were breathing. And somewhere in Attilan, a young nobleman named Medusa Maquilin was being told, by the Genetics Council's formal assignment, that her new responsibility was to learn the language of the new king's silence and to carry his meaning to the world on his behalf. She did not know, the morning she accepted that assignment, that she was also being assigned a place at the centre of everything that was going to happen next. No one told her that part, no one knew it yet. Medusa Maquilin came to the assignment with the particular advantage of having no strong prior expectation about what the king would be like. She was 18 years old, a year younger than Blackagar, and she'd grown up in the noble household of the Inhuman family at a sufficient distance from the royal palace that the new king was, to her, an interesting fact about the world, rather than someone she had strong feelings about. She knew he'd been in the chamber, she knew about the voice. She had heard various versions of what had happened with the Kree ship, filtered through the court's habit of describing alarming things in language that kept the alarm at a distance. She arrived for her first session with him prepared to find a formally distant, probably difficult young man who communicated in ways she would have to learn, like studying a foreign language. What she found was someone who had clearly been doing exactly what the assignment required of her, except in reverse, for years longer than she had. He was already reading her when she walked into the room. She could feel the quality of his attention before she had said anything, which told her that whatever language she was going to learn, he was already fluent in a version of it, and that the learning was going to go in both directions, whether the council had designed it that way or not. The Terrigen Mists had given Medusa hair. This is the formal description, and it is technically accurate, and it fails entirely to convey what that meant. Each strand of her hair was independently controllable, responsive to her conscious intention, with a precision that exceeded what most people could achieve with their hands. Collectively, her hair could lift an object weighing several hundred kilograms. It could interpose itself between an attacker and a target with sufficient force to stop a blade. It could perform tasks of extraordinary delicacy, threading a needle, untying a knot in the dark, steadying something that a hand could not reach. It moved with her mood when she was not actively suppressing it, which meant that anyone watching her closely enough could read her emotional state through the behaviour of her hair, a fact she was aware of and had learned to use and conceal with equal facility. She and Black Bolt spent 3 months developing their working vocabulary before she addressed the court on his behalf for the first time. Those 3 months, which are described in the council's session notes as an orientation period, and which are documented in considerably more human detail in the personal records that Medusa kept, and which formed part of the historical basis for the 1998 Jenkins series, were the foundation of everything that followed. They were also, in retrospect, the period in which the formal assignment became something the formal assignment had not intended to become, which is the way those things generally go. The communication system they built together over those 3 months was not simply an expansion of the formal Inhuman sign language. It incorporated elements of that language, but it was also built around the specific vocabulary of his face, which Medusa mapped with the same methodical care he had spent years applying to everyone else's. The angle of his left eyebrow, the quality of stillness in his jaw versus the quality of stillness in his jaw when he had already decided something. The particular configuration of his hands at rest versus his hands when he was holding something back. The way his eyes moved when he was thinking through a problem versus when he had already arrived at a conclusion and was waiting for the room to catch up. She catalogued these, she tested her interpretations against observable outcomes, she refined her understanding with the patience of someone who had decided, somewhere in the 2nd month of the assignment, that she was going to do this fully or not at all. By the time they stood together in the throne room for the first formal council session, she could translate him in real time with an accuracy that startled even the council members who had designed the assignment and believed they understood what they were creating. What they had been trying to create was an interpreter. What they had actually created was a partnership, though it would take the court several years and several dramatic political events to fully recognise that what Medusa said when she spoke for Black Bolt was not a summary of his intentions processed through her judgment, but a precise transmission of them, delivered in language because she happened to have access to language and he did not. The distinction mattered enormously to both of them. The royal family took shape around them over the years that followed. Each member of the family carried a function in relation to the Silent King that was partly martial, partly political, and partly something harder to name. The function of being the visible expression of a ruler who could not make himself visible in the usual way. Karnak, Black Bolt's cousin, was the family's philosopher-warrior, a man who had deliberately refused terrigenesis on the grounds that he did not want his abilities defined by a process he had not chosen, and who had spent decades in martial training that had produced something arguably more extraordinary than most terrigenesis results. Karnak could find the flaw in anything, any object, any system, any argument, any plan. Given sufficient time to observe, he could identify the precise point at which the thing was weakest, the exact application of pressure that would cause it to fail. He served as the king's tactical analyst, the advisor who told him where the cracks were before anyone had applied the pressure. Gorgon, another cousin, was larger than most Inhumans and louder than most of them, with hooves where feet would normally be, and a personality that compensated for the king's silence by being, in most rooms he entered, several conversations at once. His terrigenesis had produced a physical power concentrated specifically in his lower body. A stomp of his hooves against the ground generated a localized shockwave of considerable force, which made him exceptional at disrupting enemy formations but tended to be hard on flaws. He commanded the royal guard with the particular authority of someone who did not need to be formally threatening because the physical fact of him was already doing that work. Crystal, Medusa's younger sister, was the family's elemental. Her terrigenesis had given her control over the 4 classical elements in ways that were still developing when she first met the wider world, and that matured, over her young adulthood, into one of the more versatile power sets in Inhuman history. She could move weather, direct flame, shape water, and shift earth, with the ease of someone who has practiced a skill until the practice becomes indistinguishable from instinct. She was also the member of the royal family most curious about the world outside Attilan's walls, a fact that would have significant consequences for the history of First Contact. Triton's terrigenesis had taken him deep into aquatic adaptation. His body was built for the ocean in ways that made the surface world inconvenient, and that made him, in the depths, as comfortable as he was uncomfortable anywhere above the waterline. He served the family as its deep scout, its intelligence operative in the parts of the world that were underwater, which were more strategically significant than most surface-dwelling civilizations appreciated. And Lockjaw was not what he appeared to be, which is perhaps the most important thing to say about him, and the thing that got said least often. He appeared to be a very large dog. He was in fact a being of extraordinary power, and, in ways that were rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging them would have required a set of uncomfortable conversations about what Inhuman civilization had done with some of its terrigenesis results, of considerable intelligence. He could teleport himself, and any number of beings he chose to bring with him, to essentially any location in the known universe. He was the family's most functionally invaluable member in any situation that required rapid response, and he was also, in the social structure of the court, completely invisible to the political calculus because he appeared to be a dog and courts deal with appearances. Together, these 6 figures, plus whatever advisors and guards and council members the political situation required, formed the working machinery of a government administered by a man who could not speak publicly. The machinery worked because each person in it was carrying a piece of what the king could not carry himself: his voice, his tactical analysis, his military authority, his elemental flexibility, his mobility, his reach beyond the island walls. He was not diminished by this arrangement. He was extended by it. The silence at the centre did not make him smaller. It made the network around him larger. The irony here is worth naming directly, because it is the first time the logic of the whole story becomes visible. The thing that separated Black Bolt from every other leader in Attilan, the thing that the Genetics Council had hoped would make him manageable, was his silence. His silence was read, by the Council and later by the wider world, as a limitation. It was not. It was the organisational structure of his entire reign. Because he could not speak, he had built a system that did not depend on him being in the room, that did not require his voice to function, that translated his decisions into action through a network of people who were each extraordinary in their own right, and who functioned as extensions of a will he had spent his entire life making precise. A king who spoke constantly would have been the centre of everything. A king who never spoke was instead the condition that made everything possible. Attilan moved during his reign. It had moved before. The city had relocated from the Atlantic island of its founding to the Himalayan highlands when the 20th century's ships and planes made the original location increasingly difficult to keep private. Under Black Bolt, it moved again, this time to the blue area of the Moon, a region of the lunar surface where some ancient engineering had maintained a breathable atmosphere for reasons that no one had ever satisfactorily explained. The move was partly strategic, partly motivated by events on the surface that made Earth proximity more dangerous than it had been, and partly a reflection of something in Black Bolt that had been forming since his childhood observations through the chamber glass, a belief that the Inhumans would be safest in a position that gave them options in every direction, that belonged to no specific world's political gravity, that could not be found and cornered. The floating city, the silent king, the 6 extraordinary figures who carried his will into the world. This was the Attilan that the rest of the Marvel Universe would discover, in stages, with reactions that ranged from wonder to hostility, to the particular confusion of people encountering something that does not fit the categories they have prepared. It was a civilization built around a discipline that most civilizations have no framework for, the discipline of not acting, of holding power in reserve, of trusting that the restraint itself was the wisdom. It was also a civilization with a brother problem. Maximus had not disappeared into the background after the incident with the Kree ship. He had been given a formal position in the court appropriate to his royal blood, and he had been performing it with the surface compliance of someone who has decided not to argue the point yet. Yet was the operative word. The Genetics Council knew it. Medusa knew it. Black Bolt knew it most of all, with the particular knowing of a man who has had years to read the face of the one person who was simultaneously most familiar and most opaque to him. The first coup was still some years off, but the distance between the present and the coup was not a distance Maximus was using to become reconciled to the situation. He was using it to plan. The language of silence, Black Bolt understood, was the right language for a king who could not speak. It was not always sufficient for a king whose brother was fluent in the language of persuasion and had several thousand Inhumans who could hear him. The question was not whether Maximus would eventually move. It was only what Black Bolt would do when he did. The argument that Maximus made every time he made it was not wrong. This is the most important and most uncomfortable fact about him, and it is the fact that the Inhuman court spent the most energy trying to suppress, because a completely wrong argument is easy to dismiss, and a partially correct one is not. Maximus argued that Attilan needed to be more than it was. He argued that a civilization which hid from the world was a civilization that was slowly contracting, that the policy of isolation had kept the Inhumans safe at the cost of keeping them irrelevant, and that a king who would not speak publicly was a king who had chosen his own comfort over his people's future. He was brilliant when he argued this. He was persuasive. He was the best speaker in any room he entered, and the rooms he chose to enter, in the years before his first formal move against the throne, were the rooms where the dissatisfaction was already present. Before the wave that damaged him, Maximus had been the more socially gifted of the two brothers in a different sense, genuinely liked rather than respected, sought out for company rather than consulted for judgment. After the wave, the charm was still there but operating differently, with a quality of calculation beneath it that had not been present before, or that had been present before but had been better hidden. His psionic abilities, always latent, had been activated by the quasi-sonic impact in ways that had disrupted their stable expression, but made them more immediately accessible. He could touch a person's mind, not control it entirely, not in the way that required his specific attention and considerable effort, but he could create impressions. He could make people feel more or less at ease. He could push a person's existing tendency in a direction he had already decided he wanted it to go. In a court where the official policy was never to say this aloud, these abilities made him quietly formidable in ways that took years for anyone to map properly. He was also an engineer. This is the part of Maximus that the history tends to underemphasize because the instability is more dramatically interesting, but the engineering was real and remarkable. He designed weapons, devices, machines that operated on principles the Genetics Council's scientists had not considered. The Atma gun, which he developed sometime in the middle period of his brother's reign, was capable of reducing a human being's cognitive function to what the technical specifications described as a primal baseline, a reduction that was functionally irreversible. He built it as a deterrent, or claimed to, a weapon so catastrophic in its implication that its existence alone would discourage challenges to whatever position he occupied at the moment. He was proud of it. He showed it to people. He wanted them to understand what he was capable of building in the specific way that people who have been overlooked want the world to understand what they can do. His first formal coup came in the 7th year of Black Bolt's reign. The mechanism was political rather than physical. Maximus had spent those 7 years building a coalition among the members of the court who believed, with varying degrees of sincerity, that his argument about the limitations of a silent king had merit. Some of them believed it genuinely. The isolation from the surface world had created real economic and social pressures within Attilan that the council's formal management had not fully addressed. Some of them believed Maximus's specific version of the remedy, rather than the underlying problem. They wanted more, faster, and Maximus had promised more in exchange for their support. Some of them were simply betting on what looked like a plausible winner. The coalition that accompanied Maximus to the throne room on the morning of the 7th year was large enough, and formally constituted enough in its documentation that the Genetics Council's procedural response to it was contested rather than straightforward. Black Bolt left the throne room without a fight. This was not passivity. This was a calculation. The coalition Maximus had assembled was real, but it was not unanimous, and the damage of a direct confrontation in the throne room, where his only weapon was the thing he had spent his life not using, was not a damage worth accepting when the alternative was a tactical withdrawal and the patience to wait for the coalition's contradictions to become visible. Maximus had gotten good at gathering support. He was considerably less good at maintaining it once the people he had gathered found themselves managing the actual consequences of his decisions. The first Maximus regency lasted 11 months. He made 3 major policy decisions in that time, 2 of which caused significant problems and 1 of which caused a crisis. The crisis involved the Atmo gun and a threat directed at the human surface world that was not implemented but was credibly enough framed that it generated a response from surface forces that Maximus had not anticipated and could not easily manage. The response required resources and diplomatic capacity that the Regency had not yet built. The coalition that had put Maximus on the throne did not dissolve under this pressure, but it developed fissures that Maximus's charm could not close quickly enough, and by the end of the 11th month the fissures had become openings, and Black Bolt walked back through the opening and resumed the throne without a second confrontation. The second coup was more sophisticated and more damaging, coming in the 14th year of Black Bolt's reign, after a period of apparent stability that Maximus had used. It became clear afterward, entirely for preparation. He used a device of his own construction that temporarily interfered with the quasi-sonic neural pathway, the specific circuit in Black Bolt's nervous system that generated the energy and that Black Bolt controlled through disciplined suppression. The device did not eliminate the power, it disrupted the control. For the hours it operated, Black Bolt's ability to suppress his voice was unreliable in ways it had never been before, which meant that making any sound at all was dangerous, which meant that communicating with anyone was dangerous, which meant that Maximus had, with one piece of engineering, created the conditions under which Black Bolt's greatest strength became his most acute vulnerability. He spent that regency differently. He was more confident, having watched the first one fail, and having concluded that the lesson was execution rather than premise. He opened negotiations with surface governments that the first regency had only threatened. He restructured several of the council's oversight functions in ways that gave him more direct authority over resource allocation. He was, by the accounts of the period, genuinely energized, the way people who have finally put a long-held plan into motion sometimes are, with the kind of conviction that makes them both more effective and harder to reach with objections. Black Bolt recovered his control over the quasi-sonic pathway by the 4th month of the Second Regency, which was approximately 3 months after Maximus's device had been expected to permanently resolve the issue in Maximus's favour. He reclaimed the throne in the 6th month, by which time Medusa had arranged what needed to be arranged, and the council members who had been most recently won to Maximus's side had been given sufficient time to observe the Second Regency's direction and develop their own opinions about it. There was a 3rd coup some years after that, and a 4th, and across all of them the same basic pattern held. Maximus argued a persuasive case, assembled a real coalition, made interesting decisions that generated interesting problems, and lost the throne back to the brother he had not managed to replace. The philosophical argument between the brothers was real, and it ran beneath all the formal political machinery. Maximus believed, and argued explicitly, that a king who will not use his power is abdicating his responsibility to his people. He was applying the logic of ordinary political leadership. A ruler must speak, must act, must make his will visible and audible to those he governs. A ruler who removes himself from the visible exercise of power is functionally refusing to rule. Silence in this reading was not discipline. It was a failure of nerve dressed up as virtue. Black Bolt could not answer this argument in the throne room. He could not answer it in public. He answered it, the only way he could, through the record of his reign, through the decisions he made and the outcomes they produced, through the civilization that existed and functioned and grew more complex while he held the throne in his particular way. The answer was in the network he had built, in the precise governance that Medusa carried for him, in the fact that the crises of the Maximus regencies consistently revealed problems that the Black Bolt reign had been navigating quietly for years. Maximus was a man who used his words the way his power worked, openly, immediately, in the direction he had already decided. He was brilliant, and his words were often genuinely compelling, and the things he built with them were extraordinary. They were also, repeatedly, more than he could fully control once they were in motion. The irony that neither brother could speak directly about, the irony that lived in the space between them in every room they occupied together, was this. Black Bolt's silence was an act of service. It was not comfortable. It was not natural. It was the sustained, daily, hourly choice of a man who understood precisely what he was holding back and what the alternative would cost. And Maximus, who could speak freely, who had never been required to measure his words before releasing them, had spent his voice on arguments that were half right and half destructive, and on weapons that threatened the world, and on coups that failed, and on brilliant engineering that served his own political ambitions more reliably than it served the people whose situation he claimed to want to improve. The man who never spoke had governed more carefully than the man who never stopped. This was not yet the irony in its final form. The final form came later, in a floating city above a harbour, in a room where only one of the brothers was present. But the irony was already visible here, in the long contest between them, in the record that was accumulating across the decades of Black Bolt's reign. Silence was not passivity. Silence was the form his authority took. The man who would not use his voice had used everything else. His observation, his planning, his network, his patience, his absolute refusal to be moved from a position he had concluded was right. He held his throne back from his brother not because he was more powerful, though in the narrow sense of raw destructive capacity he was. He held it because he was right about something Maximus was wrong about, and the thing he was right about was the most uncomfortable claim in politics, that restraint is sometimes the correct use of power, that the king who chooses not to act preserves options that the king who acts impulsively destroys, that the silence, the long daily silence of a man who could level a building with his breath, was the thing that made everything else possible. He could not say this. He had never been able to say it. The argument was inside him in the way all his arguments were, complete, considered, maintained with the same discipline he brought to everything. And Maximus, who had every opportunity to make the counter-argument in every room in Attilan, continued to make it. For all the years that followed, for all the years that were coming, the voice that had broken him had also, in the strange way of things, given him his cause. And the cause was real, even when the man pursuing it was not quite right about it. But harder things were coming than anything Maximus had arranged. The world outside Attilan's walls had been growing more complex, more various, more populated with beings who had their own extraordinary capabilities and their own ideas about what the Inhumans should be. The first of those encounters was already approaching, carried on the wings of a young man who could set himself on fire and who had met a girl with the power to move the world. Crystal had been living in hiding on the surface for approximately 3 months when Johnny Storm found her. She was 17 years old, and she had been separated from Attilan following an accident during one of the city's periodic relocations, stranded in the human world with her powers, her training, and no usable communication channel back to the island. She had been managing. The elemental abilities Terrigenesis had given her were practical in ways that helped with immediate problems. She could warm a space without visible fire, She could find and direct water. She could apply force to situations that required it. What she could not do was blend. She was not built for blending. The inhuman Terrigen process tends to produce people who are visibly extraordinary in one way or another, and Crystal's way was not the kind that benefited from being noticed. Johnny Storm was 17 and actively in the business of noticing things. He found her, in the somewhat chaotic manner documented in the early Fantastic Four encounters, through a combination of pursuing interesting phenomena and being the Human Torch, which in practice meant he was rarely in any specific place by design, and often in the right place by accident. He was also, in the way of 17-year-old young men who encounter 17-year-old young women with unusual abilities, immediately interested in something beyond the tactical situation. This is relevant to the subsequent history because the relationship between Johnny Storm and Crystal, which began in these circumstances and persisted across years and complications, and the fundamental obstacle of belonging to different civilizations with different rules, became one of the primary threads connecting Attilan to the wider Marvel world for a significant period. Gorgon arrived on the surface looking for Crystal and was found first. He was not subtle. A large being with hooves who generated shockwaves when agitated was not well designed for the quiet navigation of surface world environments, and the attention he drew brought the wider situation to the notice of parties who might otherwise not have been involved. The Fantastic Four responded to the resulting incidents, which created an encounter that was not a battle exactly, though it had the structural elements of one, and which resolved into something more complicated than either party had initially positioned themselves for. The Inhuman Royal Family's first extended contact with the Fantastic Four, which the comic record documents beginning with Fantastic Four, issues 45 through 47, and which in the in-universe timeline represents the first formal, sustained encounter between the Inhumans and a significant surface presence, changed the nature of Attilan's relationship with the wider world permanently. Not because the encounter itself resolved any large question. It did not. It changed things because Crystal stayed in contact with Johnny Storm after it was over, and because that contact eventually produced a channel of communication between the two civilizations that Black Bolt had not planned and could not, by the time he was aware of its extent, easily close. His position on the world outside had always been complicated in ways that the formal Inhuman policy of isolation did not fully reflect. Isolation was the policy, but isolation was not the same as indifference. He had spent years reading the intelligence reports his network produced about the surface world. He knew what was happening out there. The emergence of a significant population of humans with extraordinary abilities, the formation of groups like the Fantastic Four and the Avengers, the ongoing evidence that the world outside Attilan was becoming more complex rather than less. He had been making a calculation about when the policy of isolation became more dangerous than the risks of engagement, and he had not yet reached a conclusion that he was confident of. Crystal's situation forced the conclusion before he was ready to make it. She was in the surface world. She had made a genuine connection with people in the surface world. Retrieving her and sealing Attilan back to complete isolation was technically possible, but practically would require either her cooperation, which was not guaranteed, or a kind of coercive action that created exactly the kind of visibility the isolation policy was designed to prevent. The Fantastic Four knew where Attilan was, or at least enough of its nature, that any aggressive move to reassert total isolation would have consequences. He chose engagement on his terms, which was the only way he ever chose anything. It was engagement with boundaries. Crystal could maintain her contact with the surface world, but as a representative of Attilan, with the understanding of what that representation required. The Fantastic Four were acknowledged as the first formal surface contact, with the limitations that implied. The wider world was not informed of Attilan's existence, but the Fantastic Four's knowledge of it was accepted rather than suppressed. It was a partial opening, carefully managed, and it was more than the Genetics Council was entirely comfortable with, and less than Crystal wanted. The consequences of the partial opening unfolded over years. Crystal did eventually join the Fantastic Four formally, the first Inhuman to participate in a surface world superhero team, a fact that was received in Attilan with the range of reactions that the Genetics Council predicted, and the range of reactions it had not predicted, which were the more interesting ones. She also eventually fell in love with Pietro Maximoff, the mutant speedster known as Quicksilver, and their marriage produced a daughter named Luna, the first Inhuman mutant hybrid child, which created a genetic category the Genetics Council had not prepared any protocol for and spent considerable energy arguing about. Johnny Storm and Crystal did not have a simple story. The complication was fundamental. He was human, in the specific sense of being mortal and surface world embedded and without the genetic heritage that made Terrigen-based decisions meaningful. She was inhuman, in the specific sense that her life was organized around genetic considerations and community obligations that his culture had no framework for. They cared about each other with the sincerity of young people who do not yet know how many times the world can separate what care has brought together. They stayed in contact across years and circumstances that made the contact difficult. The relationship was never clean, never resolved into the simple ending that would have made it easier to describe. Black Bolt watched the situation with his precise, continuous attention and drew conclusions from it that he did not share with the court. What the Human Torch and Crystal represented was not a complication to be managed. It was information. It was evidence of what happened when an Inhuman engaged genuinely with the surface world. The surface world engaged back. The Inhumans were not, as some in the court believed, so far beyond the human experience that contact would always be destabilizing. They were instead interesting to the humans in the same way that they found the humans interesting, which was a more equal exchange than the Inhuman court's sense of its own superiority quite allowed for. The Fantastic Four themselves, once the initial encounter resolved into something other than mutual alarm, were not what the Inhuman court had expected. Reed Richards was a scientist of extraordinary range and depth, who was immediately and genuinely fascinated by the Inhuman genetic heritage, by the Terrigen process, by the 25,000-year history of a civilization that had been conducting its own human genetic research since before the Egyptians built their first monuments. His interest was not threatening. It was collegial, which was an unexpected register for a relationship that the Inhuman diplomatic tradition had no category for. Sue Storm was perceptive in ways that went beyond her ability to turn invisible. Ben Grimm was, beneath the profound transformation that Terrigenesis might have classified as an unfortunate outcome, exactly the person he looked like from the outside. Someone who had made peace with a situation he had not chosen by deciding that the people around him mattered more than the circumstances. The contact with the Fantastic Four also gave Black Bolt his first extended observation of how the wider surface world handled extraordinary ability. What he saw was instructive and complicated. People with remarkable powers forming teams and facing threats, and operating in a public culture that his entire civilization had been structured to avoid. They did it imperfectly. They made decisions in the open and faced the consequences in the open, and sometimes the consequences were catastrophic and they continued anyway. It was a way of operating that was entirely unlike Attilan's careful, documented, council-monitored approach, and it was clearly in its own terms functional. He filed what he observed. He continued to govern. He accepted that the world had found Attilan, or at least found its edge, and that the question of complete isolation was no longer genuinely on the table in the way it had been before Crystal's accident. He made the best of an opening he had not planned for, and over time the opening became a feature of the situation rather than a departure from it, and the relationship between the Inhumans and the surface world's heroes became one of the defining political facts of the era he was governing through. What he could not entirely account for in any of the planning that the contact with the surface world required was what came next. Not the Human Torch, not the Fantastic Four, not Maximus's ongoing scheming, or the Genetics Council's ongoing management of the situation, or the ongoing question of what the isolation policy had been protecting and whether it was protecting the right things. What he could not account for was the fact that Medusa was pregnant, and that the child they were expecting was carrying in its developing genetic profile a combination of inherited traits that the Genetics Council's instruments read with the same alarm that Agon's instruments had read when they first examined the anomaly in the unborn Blackagar's neural pathway. The same alarm, pointed now at a new child, a new set of consequences, a new impossible calculation that would be his and Medusa's to make. The world had found them. That was manageable. What was coming now was something closer to home, something that lived in the palace's own rooms and carried the family's own history in its cells, and that was already, before it could walk or speak or understand the situation it had been born into, the subject of a council assessment that used words like risk and containment, and the particular careful language of people who have decided something and are dressing the decision in the vocabulary of science, so they do not have to call it what it is. The Genetics Council's assessment arrived in written form, as these things always did. Formal language, structured argument, numbered conclusions. The document was 3 pages, and it took Black Bolt less than 2 minutes to read it, though the 2 minutes that followed the reading lasted considerably longer than time usually allows for. He held the document. He did not move. The particular quality of his stillness in those 2 minutes was one that Medusa, watching from across the room, identified as the stillness of a man who has received information that confirms something he had already been afraid of. Ahura Boltagon had been born 4 months earlier. The birth had been uncomplicated in the physical sense, which was the sense that mattered to the medical team, and which was the only sense the formal record reflected. In the other senses, the birth had been the beginning of a complication that the family and the Genetics Council had been living inside since the moment the initial genetic scans came back, in the late weeks of the pregnancy, showing a profile that the Council's instruments did not have clean categories for. The child had inherited the quasi-sonic genetic signature from his father. He had also inherited, through his paternal uncle's disrupted neural architecture, a psionic element that was not Maximus's specific ability, but was something adjacent to it, an unbounded mental reach that extended involuntarily into the people nearby, creating impressions, amplifying emotions, occasionally producing in those nearby effects that the medical geneticists, choosing their words carefully, classified as ambient psionic contamination. What this meant in the nursery was that the nurses assigned to Ahura's care reported, within the first 2 weeks, unusual experiences while on shift, vivid intrusive thoughts that did not feel like their own, elevated emotional states, an occasional sense of the child's internal experience transmitted directly rather than expressed through behaviour. The reports were logged. The medical team expanded its assessment. The Genetics Council convened. The 3-page document was the result. The document's conclusions were structured as recommendations, because the Council had learned, across the years of Black Bolt's reign, that framing its positions as recommendations produced better outcomes than framing them as requirements. The primary recommendation was that the child be relocated to a specialized environment in the lower levels of the palace complex, a space that had been modified with psionic dampening materials, and that could be managed with a staffing rotation designed to minimize extended individual exposure. The secondary recommendation was that this arrangement be formalized rather than temporary, given the genetic profile's indicators of persistence and potential intensification across developmental stages. The tertiary recommendation was that the formal pterogenesis schedule for the child be deferred until the initial stabilization period had established a baseline. The Council had not recommended termination. In the later years, when the history of Ahura's childhood became part of the Inhuman record that outsiders read and formed opinions about, there were accounts that suggested termination had been proposed and rejected. The formal record does not support this. What the formal record does show is that the possibility of preventing the pregnancy from continuing had been raised in a preliminary council session before the formal assessment was completed, and that this discussion had ended when Black Bolt was informed it was happening and communicated through Medusa, a response that the session's scribe recorded only as immediate and unambiguous. The discussion was not raised again. He held the 3-page document. He set it down. He looked at Medusa with the expression she had spent years learning to read, and the conversation that followed was conducted entirely without audible language and lasted 23 minutes. What was decided in those 23 minutes was not a simple agreement to comply with the Council's recommendation. What was decided was more complicated than that, and the complication was in the specific form it took. They agreed, together, and they would both carry the agreement, and neither of them would pretend it was only the Council's decision. It was theirs. They were making it. Ahura was moved to the lower levels. His environment was made comfortable. The staff rotation was implemented. The psionic dampening reduced the involuntary reach to a level that the medical team's instruments classified as manageable, which meant that the nurses on rotation experienced less of the intrusive transmission and more of the ordinary experience of caring for a small child who was, in the ways that had nothing to do with his genetic profile, simply a child. He was curious about objects. He had strong preferences about sleeping positions. He did not respond well to loud noises, which was a preference he shared with his father for reasons that had nothing to do with genetics. Black Bolt visited. He came to the lower levels at intervals that the records show were more frequent than his formal schedule would have accounted for if the visits had been optional obligations. He stood outside the modified environment, and he looked through the specially constructed viewing system at his son, who was being observed and cared for and growing in the careful way of a child who is being protected from consequences he is too young to understand. The visits were wordless in the sense that all of Black Bolt's communications were wordless. They were not silent in any meaningful sense. He brought with him, each time, a quality of attention that people who have learned to read him recognize as the thing he substituted for everything he could not say. He could not whisper good night through a door. He had tried once, early in Uhura's time in the lower levels, standing in the corridor outside the sealed environment at the end of a day that had been long in the way that days are long when they require a particular kind of sustained endurance. He had stood there for a long time. He had thought about his father at the glass of the containment chamber, the daily visits, the formal sign language developed to bridge an unbridgeable distance. He understood, standing in that corridor, that he had become his father, in the sense that mattered most, and the sense that hurt most. He had made the same decision Aegon had made, that the risk of the power outweighed the right of the child to an ordinary childhood, and that the father who understood what the power could do was the right person to make that assessment, and that being the right person to make the assessment did not make the assessment any easier to live with. He had no voice for what he felt about it. He had never had a voice for anything. But the silence outside Uhura's room was a different quality of silence than the silence he maintained in the throne room, or in the council chambers, or in the meetings with the surface world's heroes. It was the silence of something that had no words, because words would not have reached the thing that needed to be said anyway. Some distances cannot be bridged by language. He had learned that at age 6 through a viewing window, and he was learning it again at an age when he had no excuse for being surprised. The Genetics Council was satisfied with the arrangement in the clinical sense of an arrangement that was functioning as designed. They monitored Uhura's development, adjusted the protocols as he grew, documented the psionic expression's evolution with the same methodical care they applied to every Inhuman genetic case. Maximus, who had been in one of his periods of formal compliance with the court when Uhura was born, found out about the arrangement through channels that were not the official channels, and responded with a kind of interested attention that Black Bolt recognized and noted and filed without responding to in any way that Maximus could read as a signal. The response to Maximus's interest came later, when it became relevant. For the period of Uhura's early childhood it remained at the level of noted and monitored, because Maximus, during his periods of formal compliance, tended to do nothing that required an active response, choosing instead to accumulate information and position for the eventual moment when his patience ran out. He had found, in Uhura, something he had not had before, a specific grievance he could articulate to the parts of the court that were sympathetic to children in general, and to the idea that the Council's power over Inhuman lives had grown beyond its appropriate scope. The son locked away. The argument practically wrote itself, and Maximus was not the person to leave a well-constructed argument unmade. He made it quietly at first, in the rooms where quiet arguments had the most traction. He was not wrong about the emotional reality of it. He was using an emotional reality he had no genuine investment in, but the emotional reality itself was real, and it resonated with the parts of the court that had always had reservations about the Council's reach. The detailed arc of events related to Uhura's various subsequent situations, which included periods under Maximus's influence and periods under various other external pressures, are documented across the Son of M series from 2006 and the Silent War arc from 2007, both by David Hine, as well as in several later storylines that deal with the ongoing consequences of the choices made in those early years. The shape of the arc in broad terms is a child who was locked away to protect those around him, who was also shaped by that protection into someone who had reasons of his own for complicated feelings about his parents, and the court that had made the decisions about his childhood. The full complexity of Uhura's story is its own long narrative. What matters here, in the story of his father, is what the locked room cost Black Bolt. Not politically, not strategically. The thing it cost that had nothing to do with governance. He had built a civilization without using his voice. He had held his throne through 3 coups without raising it. He had managed the first contact with the surface world and the ongoing relationship with the Fantastic Four, and the internal tensions of Attilan's rigid hierarchy, all without speaking publicly. He had sustained the silence for decades because he understood what the alternative was, and he had not found the silence easy, but he had found it possible. What he had not found possible was a way to be, in the ordinary sense of the word, a father. The chamber had taken his own childhood, the voice had taken his brother's stability, and now the genetics had taken, if not his son's childhood exactly, then the version of his son's childhood where a father could put his hand on a door and make his presence known through it, could sit on the other side of a glass and communicate through the rich vocabulary of face and hand that he had spent his life developing, could tell the child, in whatever imperfect language was available to them, that the locked room was not a verdict on the child's worth, that the silence outside the door was not indifference, that the thing that required the locked room was the same thing that had required the locked room when Agnes built the first one. Not a punishment, but a protection, and the distinction between the two was real even when it did not feel real from inside the room. He could not say this. He could not sign it through a window. The environment's construction did not allow for the viewing systems that the original chamber had used, because the psionic dampening materials had requirements that the optical transparency systems could not accommodate. He was on the other side of a door that his son could not see through, visiting at intervals, standing in a corridor with the particular quality of attention that was all he had left to give, carrying in his silence the love that a voice would have required in order to be audible. The meeting was Reed Richards' idea, and Reed Richards' ideas tended to be either very good or very large, and this one was both. The reasoning was straightforward once it was laid out, which is the quality that made Richards' proposals generally harder to argue with than they deserved to be. The Marvel world was accumulating extraordinary individuals at a rate that existing governance structures were not designed to handle. The Avengers addressed threats reactively. The Fantastic Four handled what came to their attention. The X-Men operated within their specific domain. But the threats that were shaping up at the level of galactic politics, at the level of reality itself, required something else. A small group of the most significant figures in their respective domains, sharing intelligence, making the decisions that no single team was positioned to make, functioning as a quiet nervous system for a world that did not know it needed one. He called it the Illuminati, which was the name that stuck despite being more grandiose than the members were entirely comfortable with. The initial meeting, documented in the Illuminati one-shot written by Brian Michael Bendis and Brian Reed in 2006, which in the in-universe timeline represents a gathering that had been occurring informally for years before it took its definitive shape, included Richards himself, Tony Stark, Charles Xavier, Namor of Atlantis, Doctor Strange in his capacity as Sorcerer Supreme, and Black Bolt. The six of them represented, between them, a distribution of power and influence that was probably unprecedented in the history of the planet. The world's most advanced scientist, its most sophisticated industrialist, its most developed telepath, the ruler of the undersea kingdom, the master of the mystic arts, and the king of the oldest civilization on the surface of the earth, a man whose voice was capable of levelling the building they were sitting in. They met in a room. They talked, or 5 of them talked, and one of them listened and indicated his responses through the careful vocabulary of his face and hands. They shared what they knew. They made decisions that the rest of the world would not know about. Black Bolt's specific contribution to the group was threefold. First, he brought the Inhuman Intelligence Network, which was the oldest and in many respects the most comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation in the history of the planet, running on 25,000 years of continuous operation, and with sources in places that the more recently established networks had not reached. Second, he brought his own capability as a physical asset, which none of the other 5 wanted to be directly relevant, but which all of them acknowledged was relevant, because the Illuminati was operating in a world where physical threats of extraordinary scale were increasingly common, and the man in the room who could destroy a city with a whisper was a fact about the room that had to be acknowledged even when it was not being discussed. The third contribution was the one that Richards had most deliberately invited, and which the rest of the group recognised most clearly once they had spent enough time in the room together. Black Bolt provided a specific quality of stillness in the group's deliberations that the other 5 were constitutionally unable to provide for themselves. 5 of them were talkers, in the broadest sense, people who processed through articulation, whose thinking was audible. 1 of them was not, and the one who was not had developed, through decades of practice, an attention to the dynamics of rooms and people that was not replicated elsewhere in the group. He noticed things before the discussion reached them. He held positions with a patience that the others sometimes mistook for uncertainty, and which was actually the discipline of a man who had learned that speaking too early foreclosed options you might need later. The Illuminati were given the Infinity Gems, the 6 stones of extraordinary power that, assembled together into the Infinity Gauntlet, had already proven capable of reshaping reality at the whim of whoever held them. The group's collective decision was that no single person should hold all 6, that each of the 6 stones should be distributed to one member of the group, and that the stones should be kept separate and, ideally, secured to a point where even the holders could not easily access them. Black Bolt kept the reality gem. It was the stone whose function was the most absolute and the most alarming. The power to make any wish, any conception of what could be actual. The group gave it to the man who was least likely to use it on impulse. They were right about the impulse. They were right in a way they did not entirely understand. The distribution of the gems was discussed across several sessions, documented in the Illuminati series written by Brian Michael Bendis and Brian Reed across 2006 and 2007. The discussion was not simple. Reed Richards made the case for collective holding on grounds of redundancy. Tony Stark made the case for individual holding on grounds of security, arguing that a collection is more vulnerable than a distributed asset because a single breach compromises all of it. Doctor Strange made a third argument that drew on the specific metaphysics of the stones and that the rest of the group found harder to evaluate on its merits. The discussion was characteristic of the group: brilliant, fractious, productive in the specific way of disagreements among people who are all substantially right about different aspects of the same problem. Black Bolt sat through it. When the position he favoured was reached, Medusa, who attended these sessions in her capacity as his voice, stated it clearly. The discussion moved in that direction. He did not take credit. He rarely took credit for anything, which was one of the qualities that made the people around him trust his judgment more than they might have trusted the judgment of someone who visibly wanted the credit. The reality gem's specific function made it an interesting choice as the stone held by the person who never expressed wishes aloud. A man who could not say what he wanted was the guardian of the stone that could make any want actual. The irony was not lost on the group, though the specific flavour of it was understood differently by different members. Richards understood it as a structural argument, the stone most requiring restraint going to the person most constituted for restraint. Stark understood it as a pragmatic assessment. If any of the 6 were going to hold the reality gem and not use it, Black Bolt was the candidate. Strange understood it as something older and less articulable, a resonance between the nature of the stone and the nature of the man that he classified as auspicious. Black Bolt understood it as an assignment and accepted it. What the Illuminati trusted in Black Bolt was his restraint. They believed, all 5 of them, that the reason to include the Silent King was that his power required deliberate choice to use, that a man who had spent his whole life not speaking was a man who had internalized the principle of holding back. They were correct about the internalized principle. What they were wrong about, and what the subsequent years would make clear, was the implication they had drawn from it, that a man who held back was a man who would hold back indefinitely, that the discipline was the same thing as the inability. It was not. It was a choice renewed every day for decades, in full knowledge of what the alternative was. And choices can be unmade. The discipline was real. The choice was real. What the Illuminati had not quite accounted for was that when Black Bolt concluded the choice needed to be different, it would be different, and the outcome of that change would not be calibrated to the group's comfort level. The meetings continued over the years. They addressed threats as they emerged, shared intelligence as it came in, made the collective decisions that needed to be made outside the visibility of the wider heroic community. They were not always right. The decision to exile the Hulk from Earth, made in that room, was one that came back to them with consequences they had not adequately modelled. The management of the Infinity Gems produced its own complications. The group's secrecy, which was operational necessity from their perspective, was experienced as betrayal by people who found out about the group and concluded they had been deliberately excluded from decisions that affected them. Black Bolt came to each meeting. He listened, in the specific way he listened to everything. He made his contributions through the system of facial expression and gesture that each of the other 5 had learned, to varying degrees, to read. He carried the reality gem to a location that the full group chose and agreed upon. He participated in the particular mode of participation available to him in everything the group did, and he returned to Attilan each time and resumed the governance of his civilization and the ongoing management of everything that governance required, including the periodic reassertion of his throne against his brother's plans and the visits to the lower levels of the palace where his son was growing up behind a psionic dampening wall. What the Illuminati did not fully discuss in any of their sessions was what the Silent King was actually doing during the deliberations. They knew he was listening. They knew he was forming positions because those positions emerged in Medusa's translations and proved reliable. What they did not fully account for was that a man with no outlet for verbal processing had developed, of necessity, an internal evaluation process more complete than the verbal kind. When people speak their thinking, they commit to positions before they have finished, because articulation requires premature commitment. He did not articulate. He held the entire problem simultaneously, for as long as the problem required holding, and he did not commit to a position until the position was finished. The Illuminati received the results of this process as conclusions that appeared fully formed. They attributed the quality of those conclusions to his restraint, which was accurate, and to a kind of conservative caution, which was not. It was not caution, it was completeness. He was not slow to commit because he was afraid to commit. He was slow because he was not done yet. The meetings continued over years. The group addressed threats as they emerged, shared intelligence, made the decisions that needed to be made outside wider visibility. They were not always right. The decision to exile the Hulk from Earth, made in that room, came back to them with consequences none of the group's modelling had adequately predicted. The management of the Infinity Gems produced its own complications, but the group held together because the thing that had brought them together, the recognition that the threats accumulating at the edge of the world were larger than any single team could address alone, had not changed. If anything, it had grown more urgent, and through all of it, the Silent King sat at the table and listened and formed conclusions that Medusa translated into the record, and the record continued, and no one around that table suspected that the figure they had been reading in some of these sessions had not been Black Bolt at all. The Illuminati were not the only secret they were keeping. Attilan's history was its own archive of silence. Every King Black Bolt had been sitting across from in those meeting rooms was carrying their own version of the same thing, a body of knowledge about the world that they had decided, for reasons each of them found sufficient, not to share with the people most affected by it. This is what the Illuminati actually had in common. Not the power, not the intelligence. The willingness to hold something back because they believed, each of them, that they were the right people to decide when it needed to be held and when it needed to be released. They were not always right about that either, but they held to it. The meetings continued. The stones were kept separate. The intelligence was shared, and no one at those meetings suspected yet that Black Bolt had not been Black Bolt for some of them. That the still, attentive presence at the table, who read their faces with such calm precision, had been, at some point, replaced by something that looked like him, but was reading them for different purposes than he would have had. The Skrull infiltration of Earth had been years in preparation by the time the world learned it had happened. The Skrulls are shapeshifters in the complete sense of the word, not simply able to alter appearance, but able to replicate the specific cellular structure of another being to a degree that passes most detection methods, that mimics powers and abilities with functional accuracy, that produces behavior indistinguishable from the original to people who have spent years with the original. They had been replacing key figures in positions of strategic significance, since before most of the individuals involved were aware the operation was underway. The operation's goal was comprehensive, to replace enough of Earth's significant power nodes that when the invasion came, the resistance would already be undermined from within. Black Bolt was among the first they targeted. The reasons were twofold, and the planning documentation, recovered in the aftermath of what became known as the Secret Invasion, is explicit about both. First, the Inhuman King's quasi-sonic voice was the single most destructive power they had identified on Earth, and controlling it, or at minimum removing it from the defensive equation, was a strategic priority before any larger move. Second, the Illuminati connection meant that a Skrull wearing Black Bolt's face, would have access to the intelligence and decision-making of the most significant secret group on the planet. The Skrulls understood what the Illuminati were before most of the Illuminati understood it themselves. The replacement happened at a point in the timeline that has never been precisely established, because one of the defining features of a successful infiltration is that the replacement point is not visible in the record. The real Black Bolt was taken. He was transported to a Skrull vessel outside Earth's atmosphere, where the Skrull scientists who had been tasked with understanding his power and potentially replicating it for use by Skrull infiltrators conducted their assessments in the specific way that the Skrull Empire applied to problems it wanted solved quickly. He made no sound. He was tortured, in the particular sense of that word that applies to someone with extraordinarily high physical endurance being subjected to techniques calibrated to exceed that endurance, and he made no sound. Not because making a sound would not have been useful to him in the immediate sense. A quasi-sonic blast at full power, uncontrolled, in the confined space of a Skrull examination room, would have been catastrophically effective. He made no sound because the confined space was a confined space, and the people around him were people, and he had spent his entire life learning that the calculation of whether to use his voice was always, and specifically, a calculation about what the voice would do to the space it entered and to the people in that space. He refused to make the calculation that would have served him, because making that calculation required accepting that the people around him were acceptable losses, and he had not made that acceptance. He remained silent. The Skrull scientists concluded eventually that the power could not be extracted or replicated with available techniques, which had been the most likely conclusion from the start. He remained their prisoner. The Skrull Black Bolt attended Illuminati meetings, reported their content back to the invasion's planners, sat on the throne of Attilan, and made decisions that were Skrull decisions made through a Black Bolt interface, and was, by all accounts of those who were present, entirely convincing. This is one of the most uncomfortable facts in the history of the Inhuman Court. The people who had spent years learning to read Black Bolt in the finest detail, who had built an entire governance structure around the specific literacy of his facial expressions and hand positions and qualities of stillness, did not detect the replacement. The Skrull's replication was precise enough to pass Medusa. It passed the Council. It passed Karnak, who could find the flaw in anything. The Skrull wore the king's face and the king's silence, and the king's careful way of holding itself, and everyone who looked at it and read it as Black Bolt was, for a period whose exact length is disputed but which the available documentation suggests was somewhere between 8 months and a year, reading a very detailed copy. He was recovered in the events of the secret invasion, when the broader operation collapsed. The details of his specific recovery are less well documented than the broader invasion story, but the outcome is clear. He was retrieved from Skrull captivity, returned to Earth, and brought back to Attilan. He walked into his throne room having been gone, in the meaningful sense, for almost a year. In the literal sense, he had not been gone at all. He had been there, being read, being consulted, being the centre of the governance that everyone in the room had continued to operate as though it were his governance. His return was not celebratory. It was careful, which is the word that applies to almost everything in his story. The court had been deceived, and the court had not known it was being deceived, and the court's knowledge that it had not known was itself a kind of damage, because the entire mechanism of his governance was built on the assumption that the people around him could read him accurately. The Skrull's successful impersonation was not just a political breach, it was a crisis in the epistemology of the court. If a copy had been convincing for that long, what did that say about the nature of what they were reading in the real version? The Skrull technology behind the replacement had been refined over years, specifically for high-value targets whose primary communication mode was non-verbal. The standard Skrull impersonation relied heavily on vocal mimicry. The specific cadence, pitch, and language patterns of the target produced a behavioral signature the Skrull could replicate alongside the physical form. For a target who did not speak, the impersonation challenge was different, and in some respects more demanding. The entire communicative burden fell on physical behaviour, on micro-expression, on the quality of attention the impersonated being directed at others. The Skrulls had studied Black Bolt for a considerable time before the replacement, which meant they had observed the court reading him, and had learned not just his signals but the court's interpretive framework. They had learned in effect how to be read as Black Bolt by people who read him every day. This was a more sophisticated operation than it first appeared, and its success was evidence of intelligence work of the highest order, which made it no more comfortable to contemplate from the inside of the court that had been the subject of that intelligence. Karnak, who could find the flaw in anything, and who spent considerable time in the months after Black Bolt's return examining his own failure to detect the replacement, reached a conclusion that was characteristically precise and characteristically uncomfortable. The flaw he had missed was not in his detection method. The flaw was in his detection assumption. He had been looking for inconsistencies in Black Bolt's behavior pattern, for moments when the signals did not match the expected output, for the specific noise that a copy produces when it is not quite exact enough. He had not found those inconsistencies because the scroll had not produced them. What Karnak had not accounted for was the possibility that a sufficiently well-made copy would not contain inconsistencies at the level of individual signals. The inconsistency, he concluded, would have been visible at the level of the pattern over time. The scroll Black Bolt had made slightly different choices, in the aggregate, than the real Black Bolt would have made, and those aggregate differences would have become detectable if someone had been looking at the pattern across months, rather than at the individual signal in each moment. No one had been doing that. No one had thought they needed to. The answer, which nobody said directly but which the court arrived at collectively over the months following the return, was something more nuanced than total doubt. The copy had been convincing because the original had been consistent. The discipline that Black Bolt had maintained for decades, the precise vocabulary of expression and gesture and stillness, had been consistent enough that a scroll trained on it could reproduce it convincingly. This was actually, if you looked at it from the right angle, a form of tribute to the discipline itself. It had been so reliable, so complete, that it could be studied and replicated. The implication was uncomfortable, but contained. The copy had worked because the original was precise, and precision in a language is both its strength and its vulnerability. The political damage from the Skrull Regency was real but bounded. Several decisions the imposter had made had to be revisited. Several relationships that had been managed through the imposter's year required recalibration. The intelligence the Skrull Black Bolt had passed to the invasion planners had contributed to the invasion's overall shape in ways that would take time to fully assess. These were manageable problems. The problem that was harder to manage was in the quality of the air in the throne room after the return. The slight difference in the way the court held itself when addressing him. The new layer of verification that had no name and no protocol but that operated anyway. The barely perceptible adjustment in how quickly people committed to an interpretation of what he was communicating. He noticed. He noticed because noticing was what he did, and because the adjustment was there to notice. He filed it without reacting to it the way he filed most things. He had no recriminations to make. The court had done exactly what the court was designed to do, which was read him and respond to what they read, and the fault was not in their reading. He applied himself to the problem that the Skrull year had created by re-establishing his record, not by changing anything, by continuing, by being precisely, consistently himself in every room, every day, in ways that slowly rebuilt the confidence that the Skrull's success had temporarily shaken. What he could not rebuild immediately was the trust that the Illuminati had placed in the group's confidentiality. The Skrull Black Bolt had attended those meetings. Whatever had been discussed there had been reported. The group reconvened after the invasion with the specific awareness that their secrets had been exposed, and with the specific silence that surrounds the moment when a group discovers it has been known from within for a period that it cannot precisely identify. The Illuminati's response was to continue, and to be more careful, because the alternative was to dissolve, and dissolving was a choice that none of them were willing to make when the threats that had made the group necessary in the first place were, if anything, growing more complex. The world outside Attilan had changed in the year of the Skrull invasion, in ways that required a response. The Kree Empire, destabilized by the Skrull infiltration of its own strategic nodes, was in a condition the Kree accusers classified as manageable disarray, and the Inhuman intelligence network classified as an opportunity of the specific kind that neither Attilan nor the Kree had ever been positioned to take before. Something unprecedented was being proposed. something that required Black Bolt to make a decision about who the Inhumans were in relation to the civilization that had created them and then abandoned them 25,000 years ago. He made the decision. It was, by most accounts of those who were close to the process, not a difficult decision. Not in the sense that it lacked complexity, but in the sense that when he had assembled all the available information and run it through the same precise internal analysis he applied to every question, the conclusion was clear. And when Black Bolt reached a clear conclusion, the pause between the conclusion and the action tended to be very brief. He accepted the Kree Empire, and in doing so, he set in motion the sequence of events that would produce the War of Kings, and the T-Bomb, and the moment in deep space where everything he had sustained and built across his entire reign would be tested in a way that nothing before it had quite managed. The Kree Empire in the aftermath of the Skrull invasion was enormous, ancient and fractured in ways that its formal structure had not yet acknowledged. Its military remained formidable, its territorial holdings remained vast. But the intelligence failures of the Skrull infiltration had revealed contradictions in the Imperial command structure that the Kree accusers, who were the Empire's operational backbone, had known about for years and had been managing through the particular method of powerful institutions that cannot acknowledge their own structural problems. By ignoring them systematically and hoping the pressure would distribute itself before it found a crack large enough to matter. The invasion had found those cracks. Ronan the Accuser had been at the edge of the situation for years, watching it develop with the attention of a man who understood that large systems do not fail all at once. They fail at the joints. He had been watching the joints. He had also been watching the Inhumans, whose role in the events of the Annihilation Wave and the subsequent conquest had given them a profile in Kree politics that they had not had before. The Inhumans were the Kree's oldest creation. They were also, by any reasonable assessment, the Kree's most successful one, and they had a king whose capabilities were, in the specific combination of power and restraint he embodied, exactly what an empire in a crisis of governance most needed and most rarely got. The formal offer was made and accepted. The details of the negotiation, which Medusa conducted on Black Bolt's behalf over several sessions, are preserved in the Kree Imperial records and summarized in the Abnett and Lanning War of Kings series from 2009, which covers the period from the acceptance of Imperial rule through the final confrontation in deep space. The Inhumans became the ruling family of the Kree Empire. Black Bolt became, in the formal Kree honorific, the Emperor of the Kree. The civilization that had created his people, that had conducted 25,000 years of genetic experiments on the ancestors of everyone he governed, that had abandoned those ancestors without a second formal communication, was now his to govern. The symmetry of it was not lost on him. He held the throne of the people who had made him. He governed the empire that had looked at its own creation and decided, on the basis of a predictive analysis, that the creation was too dangerous to allow. The Oracle had been right, in a sense the original analysts had not intended. The Inhumans were instrumental in the Kree Empire's transformation, though the word destruction was perhaps not quite right for what was happening. They were not destroying the Kree Empire, they were becoming it, which was a more complete form of the thing the Oracle had feared. The problem was Vulcan. Gabriel Summers, mutant son of Corsair of the Starjammers, and therefore brother to Scott and Alex Summers, had survived what should have been unsurvivable, and had emerged from it with an energy absorption and projection power that had grown, in the years since, into something that had very few practical limits. He had taken the Shi'ar Empire in a series of moves that were more direct than the word political implies, and had made himself Emperor Vulcan, with Shi'ar Princess Deathbird as his empress, and the full weight of one of the galaxy's most militarized civilizations behind his ambitions. His ambitions included the Kree Empire. He was not prepared to have the Kree Empire acquired by a new ruling family, when he had already decided the Kree Empire was his next acquisition. The War of Kings opened with Shi'ar aggression against Kree holdings and escalated in the manner of wars that have a personal dimension beneath the political one, faster than the logistical reality supported, more bitter than the strategic situation required, shaped by the specific character of the individuals at the top. Vulcan was not a patient man. He was a powerful man who had been wronged, in his own reading of his history, by almost everyone who had ever been in a position to help him, and who had decided that the solution to having been wronged was to be so powerful that no one would be in a position to wrong him again. This is a strategy that produces effective conquerors and terrible administrators, and Vulcan was both. Black Bolt managed the war from a position that was simultaneously more powerful and more complicated than any position he had occupied before. He was governing a civilization of billions, not thousands. He was coordinating military operations on a scale that Attilan's royal guard had no precedent for. He was doing all of this through the same systems of communication and delegation that had governed Attilan. The network of people who carried his will into the world extended now to a galactic scale, which meant that the precision and reliability of that network was being tested by distance and complexity in ways it had not previously encountered. The network held. Medusa was extraordinary in this period, managing the political dimension of the imperial role with the capability of someone who had spent decades carrying a government in her voice, and who had, it turned out, been building political skills that did not depend on having a king's mandate to exercise them. He had been working on the T-bomb for some time before the war made it relevant in the immediate sense. The concept was his, drawn from the same deep knowledge of Terrigen science that had built Attilan's Terrigenesis chamber and that had been the foundation of the Inhuman civilization's self-understanding for 25,000 years. The T-bomb was designed to work the way the Terrigen Mists worked, but at a scale that had no precedent. Instead of a chamber, the entire galaxy would be the chamber. Instead of controlled exposure, the detonation would release a modified Terrigen compound in a quantity and at a pressure sufficient to reach every living being within the weapon's blast radius. Every person, in every species, in the affected region would undergo the inhuman version of Terrigenesis. What the T-bomb would do to beings who did not carry the specific inhuman genetic heritage was the central uncertainty the Council of Science had been working around for the entire development period. The honest answer was, they did not know. The Terrigen process was calibrated, in its standard form, for the inhuman genome. Applied to species without that specific heritage, the effects were unknown in the way of variables that had never been tested at scale. The Council classified this uncertainty in their reports, with the careful language of scientists who have decided to proceed anyway and want the record to reflect that they understood the implications. Black Bolt classified it differently in his own internal assessment. The T-bomb was a weapon of last resort, which meant it was a weapon he intended never to use, which meant that the question of what it would do was the question of a scenario he intended to prevent from occurring. The scenario occurred. The war's trajectory, across the months of its most intense phase, moved in the direction of a final confrontation that neither side had designed, but that the logic of the conflict produced anyway. Vulcan and Black Bolt in the same space, with the full weight of their respective empires' histories and their respective personalities behind them. Vulcan spoke constantly, in the confrontation, in the manner of a man whose voice was both his power and his method of maintaining control over a situation. Black Bolt was silent, in the manner of a man who had nothing to prove through speech, and whose voice, when it was used, did not leave room for follow-up. He made the decision to detonate the T-bomb with Vulcan in proximity, knowing that proximity meant he was in the blast radius with the man he was trying to stop. This was not a decision he was expected to make. The weapon's deployment protocols assumed a delivery mechanism that would allow the deploying party a certain distance from the detonation. He had not followed the deployment protocols. He had brought the weapon with him, and he deployed it in the middle of a confrontation in deep space, which was not the protocol, and which produced an outcome the weapon's designers had not modelled. The detonation's immediate effects were documented by the surviving Kree and Shah ships in the engagements area. The blast created the anomaly now catalogued as the fault, a rift in space-time of considerable scale whose implications took years to fully understand. The energy release was sufficient to knock both Vulcan and Black Bolt from the recorded engagement space into areas that the ship's instruments could not immediately track. The Shi'ar force broke off its engagement. The Kree force did the same. The war ended in the sense that the active military operations stopped, because both commanders were gone and neither side hadn't agreed upon next step for a scenario in which the commanders were simultaneously missing. The Inhuman court received the news in stages. First that the detonation had occurred, then that both Vulcan and Black Bolt were missing from the engagement area. Then, as the days passed without either reappearing, a formal assessment that the king was most likely dead. Medusa received this assessment with a specific quality of controlled composure that was her version of Black Bolt's stillness. the face arranged to communicate what the situation required and whatever was actually happening inside handled privately and later. She assumed leadership of the Empire and of Attilan. She was, by the accounts of the people who worked with her in that period, effective in ways that surprised people who had primarily known her as the translator rather than the voice. She had always been both. The translation function had obscured the fact that the decision she was translating had been the product of a genuine collaboration, that her understanding of Black Bolt was deep enough that she was not simply conveying what he communicated, but was participating in its construction. Without him to translate, she governed in her own voice, which turned out to be a formidable instrument in its own right. For a period, it looked like this was the end of his story. The king who had held his voice for 30 years had used it in the final extremity, and had apparently not survived the using. There was something that looked like resolution in it, even to the people who mourned him. A life lived in the discipline of restraint, ending in the single decisive act that the restraint had been building toward. A king who had never spoken publicly, had used his power in the moment that required it, and had not returned. It looked, if you squinted at it, like the end of the particular kind of story that requires everything to cost everything in order to mean what it means. It was not the end. What it was a door that looked like an ending, and behind the door was a deep space prison. And in the prison was a man in the process of learning who he was when the crown was gone, when the silence was not a discipline but a circumstance, when the only question was the one he had been postponing since the chamber years. Who is Blackagar Boltagon when he is not the king? The prison had no name that translated cleanly into any language spoken on Earth. It existed in the space between mapped systems, in the kind of absolute remove from anything familiar that deep space provides to structures designed to be unfindable. Its operator, known to its inmates as the jailer, ran the facility on a commercial model that was more sophisticated than it first appeared. Powerful beings, captured and contained, could be studied, could be exhibited to paying observers from various civilizations who had specific reasons for wanting to observe someone like Black Bolt in conditions of reduced power, and could be used as leverage in negotiations that the jailer conducted from a position of owning things other people very much wanted back. The power suppression was the first thing he had to understand. The collar, or its functional equivalent, did not remove the quasi-sonic ability. The ability was not located in an organ that could be shut off with an external device. What the suppression mechanism did was interfere with the neural pathway between the intention to generate sound and the generation itself, creating a delay and a disruption that made control, always requiring enormous effort, substantially more effort than he could reliably sustain. Using his voice in the prison was possible. Using it controllably was not, which meant, in the practical terms of a man whose entire life had been organized around the controlled application of a power that was catastrophic in its uncontrolled form, that using his voice was not an option he could take without accepting consequences he could not predict. He had been in this position before, the chamber, the years of learning control from inside a sealed environment, developing discipline through the sustained practice of not doing what the power constantly pressed him to do. He had done it once. He did it again. The prison environment was not the chamber, but the fundamental task was the same. Exist here, in this space, without the power and without speaking, and without the identity that the power and the speaking had been central to, and find out what remains when those things are removed. Saladin Ahmed's Black Bolt series from 2017, across its 12 issues, documents this period with a specificity and an intimacy that the broader event storylines cannot quite achieve. Ahmed was interested in the question of what happens to a man whose entire identity has been organized around a single, defining discipline when that discipline is no longer the relevant variable. The prison stripped Black Bolt of his title, his court, his city, his network, his translator, and his carefully maintained social vocabulary. It left him with what he had been in the chamber as a child, a person in a sealed space, trying to understand and be understood without access to the full range of instruments that people usually use for that purpose. He found other ways, he always found other ways. The communication methods available to him in the prison were cruder than the refined vocabulary of expression and gesture he had developed with Medusa, because the people around him had not spent years learning his face. He improvised. He was patient with the imprecision of improvised communication, in the way of someone who had been patient with imprecision his entire life and had learned that patience, applied consistently, produced understanding even when speed could not. The process was slower. It was also, in ways he had not anticipated, occasionally better. The people in the prison who did not know the formal system of the king were not reading the king. They were reading the person. Blinky was a blue-skinned alien girl of indeterminate age who had been in the prison for a period longer than she could reliably remember, and who had, as a coping mechanism that had become a character trait, decided that the most useful response to almost any situation was to be cheerful about it. She was not naive. She understood the prison for what it was, and the jailer for what he was, and the odds of any given person getting out for what they were. She was cheerful anyway, in the specific way of people who have decided that the alternative is not a form of honesty but a form of defeat. She attached herself to Black Bolt with the practical directness of a small person in a dangerous place who has identified a large person as worth staying near, and she was, across the period of the prison arc, the person he communicated with most fully and from whom he received in return the specific quality of attention that Medusa had given him, without the system they had built to support it: honest observation, patient interpretation, willingness to ask again when the first reading did not feel right. He reckoned with his choices in the prison in the way that reckoning tends to happen, in places that remove the normal distractions. Not in a structured internal tribunal, not in a scheduled period of reflection, but in the small hours of the prison's artificially regulated night cycle, when the ambient noise of the facility was at its minimum and the quality of silence was close enough to the silence he had chosen that the difference between the chosen silence and the imposed silence became very clear. The chosen silence was a discipline, the imposed silence was a condition. He had spent his life in the first and had understood it very well, and he had not, until the prison, fully understood how much of what he had believed was clarity about himself was actually the clarity of a very well-organized system in which his identity was consistently reflected back at him by people who knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. In the prison, no one knew. In the prison, he was a large being with a suppressed power and no obvious social context, and the question of who he was had to be answered, or at least approached, without reference to the answer that had always been available before: King, Inhuman. The man with the voice that could not be used. The silent centre of a network of extraordinary people. These answers were not available. What was available was what he actually did when the categories were gone. The choices he made when the choices were not structurally predetermined. The way he treated people when the people had no prior investment in treating him as a king. The values he applied to situations where the values could not be traced back to the formal governance requirements of the Inhuman throne. He helped people. This is the simplest description and the most accurate one. He helped people in the prison in the ways available to him, which were not the ways that the king of Attilan could help people, but which were the ways available to a being of considerable physical capability and substantial observational skill who had decided, in the absence of any other organizing principle, that the people around him were the people around him, and that their situation was therefore his situation, and that the appropriate response to that was the response he had always given to that conclusion, which was to do what could be done. He did not resolve all his reckonings in the prison. The reckoning with Ahura, specifically, did not reach a resolution. It reached a fuller understanding of the weight of it, which is a different thing. The thing he had done to his son, the thing he and Medusa had done together, had been the product of a genuine belief that it was the right decision in the circumstances, and the prison did not change his belief that the circumstances had been what they were. What the prison changed was his comfort with having done the right thing. He had done the right thing, and it had cost his son his ordinary childhood, in the same way that Argon had done the right thing and it had cost him his. He had made the same decision his father had made, with the same evidence and the same logic, and the outcome was the same outcome. The generational repetition of it, which was visible from the prison in a way that the governance of an empire tends to make difficult to see clearly, was something he sat with in the prison's night cycle, and did not find a comfortable resolution for. He escaped the prison in the manner that these things tend to resolve in the comics, which is through a combination of capability reasserting itself under sufficient pressure, allies making contributions that change the available options, and the specific determination of a person who has decided that the prison is temporary, and that the decision to treat it as permanent would be the actual defeat. He left with Blinky and the others who had been with him, or at least with those who survived the sequence of events that the prison's end required. He left carrying what the prison had given him, not resolution, but clarity of a different kind than he had had before, the kind that comes from knowing what you are without the structures that usually define you. He merged from the prison into a universe that had been continuing without him. The fault created by the T-bomb had produced consequences. The Kree Empire was being managed. Attilan was floating, his son was in the lower levels of the palace, his brother was scheming in whatever particular way the brother was always scheming. The specific configuration of everything had shifted while he was gone, in the way that everything shifts while attention is elsewhere, and the return required the same slow, rebuilding process that every return from a significant absence requires. But something else was coming. Something that had been developing while he was in the prison, that Thanos had been preparing with the patient efficiency of a mind that is never in a hurry, because patience is just another instrument of will. A demand was coming, and the demand was going to bring all of it to the same moment. The voice, the sun, the silence, the city, and the 34 years of discipline that had been building, without his full knowledge of its eventual purpose, toward a single whisper in a stone room above New York Harbour on a clear October evening. He returned to Attilan. He resumed the throne. He sat in the long silence of a king who has been somewhere that changed him and has not yet spoken about it, which he could not do anyway, and which in this case would not have captured it even if he could. He looked at the city. He looked at the council. He looked at the door to the lower levels and the sun behind it, and the calculation that had not changed since he had made it, and that he would make again if required, because the calculation was correct regardless of its cost, and far away, in a direction that his intelligence network would eventually identify and characterize and bring to him in a formal report with a formal recommendation, Thanos was moving. The Avengers left Earth in the early days of the Builders campaign, drawn into the largest military engagement the galaxy had seen since the Annihilation Wave, and the timing of their departure was not coincidental. Thanos had been watching. He watched most things most of the time, with the sustained attention of a being who had decided at some point in his very long history that the universe was a problem to be solved, and that solving it required complete information. He watched the Avengers leave. He watched the defensive posture of what remained. He watched the various power nodes that had previously been occupied by people who were now a considerable distance away. And when he was satisfied that the window was of sufficient width, he moved. His first communication to Attilan was delivered by Corvus Glaive, his lieutenant, who arrived on the island with the particular authority of someone who was a message rather than a messenger. His presence was the content. The demand he delivered was formal in its language and absolute in its intent. Thanos required, as tribute from the Inhuman people, the severed heads of all Inhuman youth between the ages of 16 and 22. The demand was framed as a standard extraction of resources from a subject population. It was framed that way deliberately. The framing was not the content. Black Bolt's intelligence network had been building a picture of Thanos' actual intention for several weeks before Corvus Glaive arrived. The network was comprehensive, and it was patient, and it had been monitoring Thanos' movements and communications for long enough to have identified the pattern beneath the stated objective. Thanos had a son. Not a son by design, not a product of any deliberate genetic program, but the consequence of a liaison many years prior with a woman who had carried latent Inhuman genetic heritage, and whose son had been born with a genetic profile that Thanos had only recently become aware of. The son was named Thane. Thane was somewhere in the Inhuman diaspora, the scattered population of people with latent Inhuman genetics, who had not been part of Attilan's formal civilization, but who carried the Kree modification in their bloodline from ancestors the Kree experiments had reached across their thousands of years on Earth. The demand for the heads of Inhuman youth between 16 and 22 was not a resource extraction. It was a search algorithm. Thane was in that age range. Thane was somewhere in that population. Thanos needed to identify him, and a demand that required Attilan to produce or account for every Inhuman youth in that cohort would either flush Thane out of hiding or give Thanos' forces a reason to conduct the search themselves in the process of enforcing the demand. The tribute was a net. The heads were the weight of it. Black Bolt understood this. He had been sitting with the understanding for the days since the intelligence assessment arrived, in the particular way he sat with the things that required the most from him, not moving through it toward a conclusion but holding it, examining it from each direction, allowing the full complexity to remain complex rather than simplifying it prematurely. The council had been convened, the intelligence had been shared, the formal recommendation had been discussed, and the formal recommendation was, in essence, evacuation. Remove the population of Attilan to a position where Thanos could not reach it, and deny him the leverage that the city's location and population provided. He listened to the recommendation. He received it with his full attention, which the council knew by now to read carefully, because his full attention did not always mean agreement, and the distinction between the two was important. He did not agree. Or rather, he agreed with the evacuation of the civilian population, and he coordinated with Medusa and with the City Engineering Division to begin the movement of non-essential Attilan residents off the island through the teleportation systems that Lockjaw and several secondary devices could support. What he did not agree with was the premise that the correct response to Thanos' arrival was a version of the response Attilan had always chosen when the world became too dangerous: move, hide, wait. The problem with waiting was Thane. If Thanos could not find his son through the tribute demand, he would find him another way. The search would continue, and while it continued, every person in the Inhuman diaspora who happened to be in the relevant age range was under threat from a being who was, by the available assessment, prepared to kill every one of them if that was what the identification of one required. The evacuation of Attilan addressed the threat to the city. It did not address the threat to the thousands of people outside the city, who were not in Attilan's political structure, but were in Thanos' search parameters. He also knew where Uhura was. Uhura was in the lower levels of the palace, in the environment that the Council's protocols had maintained for years. The evacuation protocols had been developed with the understanding that the lower levels were among the last areas of the facility to be cleared, because the environmental requirements for the psionic dampening systems meant that Uhura's transport required a different protocol than standard evacuation. He was not first in the queue. He was accounted for, he was in the process, but he was not first. The terrible arithmetic of the situation was this: every option that did not involve Black Bolt directly confronting Thanos bought time for some people while leaving others exposed for longer. The evacuation was necessary. The evacuation was already underway. But the time the evacuation required was time that Thanos' fleet was spending in proximity to Attilan, and in proximity to every Inhuman in the diaspora who was not yet out of range, and in proximity to the specific vulnerability in the lower levels of the palace that the evacuation protocols had not yet cleared. He had a weapon. He had always had a weapon. The weapon was in his voice. The voice was also, in the specific environment of a throne room in a floating city above a harbour, the most destructive option available to him. A full quasi-sonic blast, or even a significant partial release, in the enclosed stone space of the throne room at the summit of Attilan's central spire, would do to the spire what his whisper had done to the Kree observation vessel 50 years earlier. The spire would fail. Attilan would be structurally compromised. The fall would be into water, which was survivable in ways that a fall onto stone would not be, but the structural damage from the sonic event and the fall would be complete and rapid. He had also been maintaining, in the lower chambers of Attilan's secondary infrastructure, something that the Genetics Council knew about and that the wider court did not. A Terrigen-based munition of considerable scale, developed in the years after the War of Kings from the same scientific principles that had produced the T-bomb, but calibrated for atmospheric dispersal rather than galactic detonation. It was not a weapon in the standard sense. It was a delivery mechanism. A Terrigen cloud, released at altitude over a populated continent, would drift through the human world's atmosphere in ways that depended on wind patterns and temperature gradients. And wherever it went, whatever latent inhuman genetics it encountered, it would trigger the same process it had triggered in Attilan's formal Terrigenesis chambers. The people it touched would emerge from their Terrigenesis cocoons as something other than what they had been before. What the combination of a quasi-sonic structural failure and an atmospheric Terrigen detonation would produce was, he had calculated, the following: the destruction of Attilan as a fixed structure, the dispersal of the Terrigen compound into the atmosphere above the eastern seaboard, an acoustic event of sufficient magnitude to inflict serious damage on any being present in the throne room at the time of the vocalization, and a signal to Thanos that could not be misread as submission. The cost was the city. The cost was everyone who had not yet been evacuated. The cost was anyone in the lower levels whose evacuation sequence had not yet completed. He knew the cost. He had a gift, by this point in his life, for knowing costs. He had been calculating costs since he was 19, and a whisper had broken his brother's mind. He had been sitting with them since Uhura went into the lower levels. He had been naming them precisely to himself, in the silence that was the only space where he could name anything, for 34 years. The discipline of his silence was, in part, the discipline of knowing what every sound cost and choosing, in every moment before this one, that the cost was too high. He was making that calculation again now, in the specific way that the calculation changes when the alternatives have all been examined and found insufficient. He sent Medusa away. She argued, in the specific way she argued when she was certain she was right, and he was making a choice she opposed, which was with the particular precise force of a woman who had spent her life as his voice, and therefore knew exactly how to use hers. He received the argument with his complete attention. He communicated through the vocabulary they had built together over decades that he had received it and had considered it, and that the decision was made. She was taken out of Attilan. She had been removed against her wishes, which was something he would carry, alongside everything else he carried, in the silence of what came after. He stood in the throne room, and he waited. The air in the room was cold. The light came in at the angle it always came in at this time of day. The particular slant of late afternoon light that came through the high windows and fell across the stone floor in long warm strips that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with the colour of it. He had sat in this room for 30 years. He knew the light. He was standing now rather than sitting, but the light was the same. Thanos entered the throne room the way very powerful beings enter rooms, not as if claiming space, but as if the space had always been organised around the possibility of their presence. He was not in a hurry. He had never, in the extensive record of his interactions with other civilizations, been observed to be in a hurry, because hurrying implied uncertainty about the outcome, and Thanos had not experienced uncertainty about outcomes in a very long time. He entered. He stood. He looked at the silent king, and he saw a ruler who would not speak. He had been told about the voice. He had received the intelligence briefings that his network produced about Attilan and its king, and those briefings included the well-documented fact that the king's quasi-sonic ability made uncontrolled vocalization catastrophic, and that the king's response to this fact was to not speak publicly. He had processed this information the way he processed most information about other beings, as a variable in the current calculation, one that reduced the king's available options in a direct confrontation to a set that Thanos' own capabilities could accommodate. A king who cannot use his primary power without destroying his own city is a king who will not use his primary power. This was a reasonable reading of the situation. It was also a reading that contained a significant error, of the kind that powerful beings who have stopped being surprised make routinely, and that they are rarely in a position to learn from. Thanos spoke. He stated his requirement in the formal language he used for these interactions, the language of the powerful addressing the less powerful, courteous in its phrasing and absolute in its content. He waited for a response. He was waiting for compliance, or a negotiating position, or a visible retreat that would require reframing as compliance in order to preserve the appearance of Attilan's dignity. He was not waiting for what he received. The Kree battle records recovered from the observation vessels stationed in the vicinity, catalogued in detail across the Infinity event documentation by Jonathan Hickman, across issues 3 through 6 of the 2013 series, describe what happened next as an acoustic event of extraordinary magnitude, brief duration, and unusual precision. Brief is a relative term. The event lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is less than the duration of a sentence, which is less than the time required to complete a breath, which is approximately enough time for the structural integrity of a room built from the dense volcanic stone that Attilan's architects had used for its central spire to begin its terminal progression toward complete failure. He opened his mouth. He made a sound. He had been holding his breath for 34 years, and the breath came out, and what came with it was everything that a life of discipline had been containing. Not rage, not grief, not the accumulated weight of the Skrull year, or the prison between stars, or the sun in the lower levels, or the brother in the council rooms, or the decades of sitting in rooms where other people spoke and he did not. None of those things were in the sound. The sound was not an expression of anything. It was a release of energy along a very precisely directed vector, targeted at the being across the throne room who had come here expecting compliance. The expression was in the targeting. He had aimed it carefully. Thanos was struck. He was struck by something that his physical capability was formidable enough to survive, which is a testament to the extraordinary durability that makes Thanos the threat he is, and which is also, in context, irrelevant to the outcome that Black Bolt had calculated. The point of the sound was not to kill Thanos. The point of the sound was to make a sound in this room. And the room responded to the sound the way rooms respond to quasi-sonic events of this magnitude. It began to come apart. The stone of the throne room cracked at the load-bearing joints. The cracks propagated through the wall material at the speed that crack propagation moves through dense stone under sudden acoustic stress, which is fast enough to be observed directly by anyone standing in the room. The floor shifted. The high windows, which had been providing the long afternoon light that fell across the floor in warm strips, became a source of a different kind of light as the wall sections around them began to separate from the structural members that had held them since Attilan's Himalayan construction phase. The room was failing. The Terrigen munition in the lower chambers detonated as Attilan's structural integrity cascaded. Whether the detonation was triggered by the acoustic event directly, or by a timer Black Bolt had set before Thanos arrived, or by a remote system that responded to the structural failure signal, is a detail that the available accounts describe inconsistently, and that does not ultimately change the shape of the outcome. The munition detonated. The Terrigen compound it had been housing began its dispersal into the atmosphere above the eastern seaboard of North America, carried on the wind patterns of late autumn in the northeastern United States. Attilan fell. It fell as a structure fails when its primary load-bearing systems have been compromised simultaneously at multiple points, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a progressive failure that moved from the top down and from the inside out. The internal structures going first, and the outer walls following at slightly different rates depending on their specific construction. It fell into the Hudson River. The water received it the way water receives large objects, without ceremony, at speed, with the enormous displacement of something replacing the volume of something else, in a space that had not been designed to hold it. Thanos was ejected from the impact zone. He survived, as he always survives, and he continued his search, as he always continues. He found Thane, eventually. That story has its own arc and its own accounting. What matters to the story of the Silent King is not what Thanos did after, but what the fall of Attilan meant in the immediate sense, in the specific accounting of what had been in the city when it fell. Uhura had been in the lower levels. The evacuation sequence for the psionic dampening environment had been operating on its own protocol, which required specific preparation that standard evacuation did not, and which was not complete when the throne room conversation ended and the room began to fail. In some accounts, the evacuation did complete in the minutes between Black Bolt's decision and the final structural failure. There are reports suggesting Lockjaw made a final retrieval run to the lower levels before the building's power systems went offline and the teleportation infrastructure lost its grid connection. In other accounts, the timing did not allow it. The historical record as it exists across the documentation from Hickman's Infinity and the subsequent Inhumanity series edited and written across 2013 and 2014 is not definitive on this specific point. The ambiguity is itself part of the story. Black Bolt had spoken knowing that Uhura was in the lower levels, knowing that the evacuation sequence was not complete, knowing that the voice in that room would begin the process that would make the evacuation sequence's completion uncertain. He had made the calculation. He had reached the conclusion that the calculation required making, and had acted on it with the precision of a man who had been making precise decisions in silence for 34 years, and was not going to be imprecise about this one. He did not kill his son. Uhura survived the fall of Attilan, by whatever combination of evacuation margin and structural luck, and Lockjaw's extraordinary abilities the specific circumstances allowed. But Black Bolt had not known when he opened his mouth that Uhura would survive. He had made a sound in a room where his son was in the building. He had destroyed the building. The survival was not the decision. The decision was the decision, and the survival was what the decision left room for, not what it guaranteed. This is the thing the story has been building towards since the first page. Not that Black Bolt killed his son, that he was willing to. That faced with an impossible calculation and a limited set of options, and a being who had come to his city expecting silence, Black Bolt had made the only choice that actually addressed the full scope of the problem rather than a portion of it. He had chosen the universe over his son, in the specific sense that the choice to speak was a choice to accept the cost of speaking, and the cost of speaking in that room was everything that was in that room, including Ahura, including the city, including the 34 years of accumulated silence that had been the substance of his reign. He had not spoken to save himself. He had not spoken to win a fight. He had spoken to make the sound he had been not making since the day he had first understood what the sound could do, and the sound had done exactly what the sound always did. And the thing it had done to Thanos was minor compared to the thing it had done to Attilan, and the thing it had done to Attilan was everything. The silence that followed was different from all the silence that had preceded it. It was not the silence of a choice being renewed. It was the silence after the choice had been made, in the specific register of a sound that has finished. The way a bell is silent after it has rung, and the ring is still present in the air, still moving through the space where the bell was, long after the mechanism has stopped. He was in the water, he was in the rubble, he was somewhere at the edge of the thing he had done, and he was silent in the way of someone for whom silence is no longer a discipline, because the thing the discipline had been containing had been released, and the air above the city was full of Terrigen, and the city was in the river, and the king was very still in the ruins of the thing he had spent his life protecting. The Terrigen cloud moved through the atmosphere of the eastern seaboard, and then beyond it, carried by the wind patterns of late autumn, drifting at the altitude and in the direction that atmospheric physics determined rather than any plan. It had no intelligence. It had no agenda. It was a chemical compound dispersed in a gas medium, subject to the same forces as any other atmospheric phenomenon, and it moved accordingly, south and then west, and then distributed through the convective mixing of the troposphere into currents that spread it further and more widely than any single point of origin could have dispersed it under still conditions. It found what it was designed to find. The Terrigen compound, calibrated for the specific genetic modification the Kree had left in the human genome 25,000 years earlier, was indifferent to borders and jurisdictions and the social categories that organized the lives of the people it touched. It was not looking for Inhumans. It was responding to a molecular signature that existed in the genome of every person who carried a Kree-modified ancestor somewhere in their lineage, however distant. The world was larger than Attilan. The Kree's experiments had been conducted at more sites than the Inhuman historical record had formally documented. There were people in the cloud's path who carried the signature and had no idea that anything about their genetics was unusual. People who had lived entirely ordinary lives in the specific sense of lives that had not yet triggered the extraordinary latency in their cells. The cocooning process, which had always been the most visually arresting part of the terrigenesis cycle for people who witnessed it, began appearing in cities and towns along the cloud's path within 24 hours of the Attilan event. Emergency services received reports. A person had encased themselves in what appeared to be a solid shell. The shell was organic in texture. The person inside was unresponsive to external stimulus. The shell was resisting all attempts to open it. The reports were filed under categories that the existing emergency response taxonomy was not equipped to handle, and they accumulated faster than the categories could be updated. Charles Soule's Inhuman series, which began publication in 2014 and documented the emergence of what the Inhuman community came to call the New Humans, traced the individual experiences of people going through this process with the kind of granular attention to specific lives that a macro-level event story cannot sustain. A woman in Tulsa found herself encased in a cocoon in her kitchen while making coffee. A teenage boy in Madrid underwent terrigenesis in his school's athletic facility. A retired teacher in Seoul emerged from a week-long cocoon with the ability to generate localized gravitational fields. The process was the same for each of them in its biological mechanics, and completely different in its personal experience, because the personal experience was shaped by everything that was already present when the Terrigen found it. The person's history, their fears, their body, their genetics, their relationships, the specific room they happened to be in when the cloud reached them. There were outcomes that were beautiful. There were outcomes that were frightening. There were outcomes that were, by any assessment, harmful in the immediate sense. People who emerged from terrigenesis with physical changes that their prior lives had given them no context for, with power expressions that were not intuitive to control, with bodies that were no longer configured in the ways they had been before. The Terrigenesis process had always produced this range within Attilan's controlled environment, where the Genetics Council's protocols and the existing Inhuman community could provide immediate support and context. In the world outside, there was no protocol and no community yet, and the range presented itself without the infrastructure that would have made it navigable. Medusa built the infrastructure. She was in the position that all leaders occupy when a crisis exceeds the existing organizational capacity. The position of building the response to the crisis at the same time as responding to it, making decisions about structure while using the structure to implement the decisions, without the luxury of a period in which the structure can be finalized before the decisions begin. She was not in this position for the first time. She had managed Attilan in Black Bolt's absence before, most recently in the period after the War of Kings, when the T-Bomb's aftermath had required someone to govern an empire and its king was missing. She was good at it. She was better at it the third time than she had been at any point before. New Attilan was established on a platform in the Hudson River, within sight of the skyline that had been watching Attilan fall for the years it had floated above the harbour. It was smaller than the original. It was also, in ways that mattered to the people who came to it, more open. The new humans who found their way there were not arriving into a civilization with a fixed hierarchy, determined by Terrigenesis outcome. They were arriving into something still being built, which had the disadvantage of incomplete infrastructure and the advantage of being organised around the people who were actually in it, rather than around a structure designed for people who had been in it for 25,000 years. The Terrigen cloud was also, it emerged in the months following the Attilan event, catastrophically toxic to mutants. This was not a known property of the Terrigen compound in the concentrated chamber form that Attilan had used for its formal Terrigenesis ceremonies. It was a property that expressed when the compound was dispersed through the atmosphere in the more dilute but more widely distributed form that the Attilan detonation had created. The specific mechanism of the toxicity, which the Inhuman science community worked urgently to document and understand in the period following its discovery, was a genetic incompatibility. The mutant genome, modified by the X gene in ways that were orthogonal to the Kree modification, responded to the Terrigen compound not with activation, but with cellular damage of a kind that was progressive and ultimately fatal if exposure continued. This produced a conflict whose moral dimension was not reducible to clear position, because the Terrigen cloud was both the worst ongoing health crisis the mutant community had faced and the source of identity for thousands of new Inhumans who had not chosen their transformation and who experienced the cloud not as a weapon, but as the thing that had revealed what they were. The Inhumans versus X-Men conflict that this produced is its own long story with its own arc and its own accounting. What it was, in the context of Black Bolt's story, was one more consequence of the decision made in the throne room. The king who had spoken once had set in motion a chain of consequences that extended far beyond what he had been able to model in the moments available for modelling. He returned to active governance gradually, in the months following the Attilan event. His physical recovery from the consequences of the acoustic detonation, the structural failure, and the submersion was documented in the Inhuman medical records as extensive and slower than his body's healing capacity would have predicted, which the medical team attributed to the sustained suppression of the quasi-sonic function that occurred when the body produces a significant acoustic event. The neural pathway that generates the energy requires recovery time proportional to the energy generated, and the energy generated in the throne room that October was the largest single output of his ability in the documented record. He came back to a world that was different from the one he had governed before, not in its broad strokes, the threats and the politics and the ongoing complexity of existing, in a universe that contained Thanos and the Kree and the mutant question, and Maximus and all the rest were still there. But the specific texture of his role in it was different, because Attilan was gone, because new Attilan was not the same as Attilan, because the new humans were not the same as the Inhuman court he had governed through sign and expression for 30 years, and because Medusa had been governing without him for long enough that she was not waiting to return the governance to him. She was extending it. The arrangement that formed was genuinely collaborative in a way that their prior partnership had sometimes aspired to, and not always achieved. What one word had built was a larger thing than any number of proclamations could have built. The Inhuman nation, if that was the right word for what the new humans and the Attilan community and the diaspora together were becoming, was larger after the fall of Attilan than it had ever been during the floating city's intact history. Tens of thousands of people who had not known they were inhuman now knew. They were navigating that knowledge with varying degrees of support and with the specific difficulty of transformations that had not been chosen, but they were navigating it, and they were, however imperfectly, part of the inhuman community that Medusa and the Council were building around New Attilan. The Silent King had spoken once. What he had destroyed was a city, a structure, a political arrangement, and 34 years of silence. What the destruction had released into the world was the largest expansion of the inhuman people in 25,000 years. Not designed, not planned. A consequence of a choice made in the space of 4 seconds in a stone room above a harbour, which is how the most significant changes in the world's history tend to arrive, suddenly, and from a direction that the people most affected had not been watching. He sat in New Attilan and he listened to Medusa's reports about the new humans, about the state of the community, about the negotiations with the surface governments, and the ongoing difficulty of the conflict with the mutant community. He received the reports with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything, across all the years, in all the rooms. He was changed from the person who had stood in the throne room that October evening, in ways that were not visible in his face and not expressible in the vocabulary of gesture and expression that people read to understand him. But the change was there. He had done the thing he had spent his life not doing. And what the doing had cost was enormous, and what it had made was enormous, and the relationship between those two things was the thing he sat with in the particular silence of the after. The Kree Supreme Intelligence had received a prediction 25,000 years ago that the race it was building on a blue-green world would eventually be instrumental in the destruction of the Kree Empire. The Supreme Intelligence had been right, and not right. The Inhumans had not destroyed the Kree Empire. They had taken it over. They had married into it, governed it, extended its history in directions it would not have found without them. The destruction the Oracle had predicted was the destruction of a boundary, the boundary between creator and creation, between the civilization that built the tool and the tool that outlived its purpose and became something that needed no purpose other than its own. This is what the Kree had been afraid of, not the Inhumans specifically. The thing the Inhumans represented, the proof that a designed thing can exceed its design, that the people you make to serve you will eventually, if you make them well enough, be something you could not have contained even if you had tried. The Kree had tried, in their way, by abandoning the project. They had walked away from 25,000 years of consequence. The consequence had come anyway, not as an army but as a king sitting across a table from a Kree ruler in the polished halls of Hala, a silent man with a voice that could destroy the room, explaining through his interpreter that the Empire now belonged to the people the Empire had discarded. The irony of Black Bolt's life, which has been visible from the beginning of this account, but which arrives now in its fullest form, is not simply that his silence was misread as weakness. That is the surface of it. The depth of it is this. The silence was the most active thing about him. Every other king in the Marvel universe has spoken. Tony Stark's authority comes from his argument, from the constant articulation of his position in language that people can evaluate and contest. Reed Richards' leadership is conducted through explanation, through the demonstration of reasoning that others can follow. Charles Xavier's project is entirely linguistic, built from the belief that the right words, spoken or projected, can change minds. Even Namor, proud and imperious, rules through declaration. Black Bolt ruled through the accumulation of what he did not say. He built a network of people who could carry his will because his will could not carry itself. He made decisions in the precision of his internal process that other leaders made in the open, and because they were made internally, they could not be argued with or delayed by the friction of contested articulation. He governed through the discipline of holding back, and the discipline produced a clarity of intention that the constant noise of verbal governance tends to obscure. The people who read him most accurately, across the decades of his reign, did not describe reading him as receiving instructions. They described it as receiving certainty, the specific quality of communication from a person who has no room in their communication for anything other than what they mean. He was dismissed repeatedly as a passive king. The Genetics Council, in their original calculation, had dismissed him as manageable. Thanos had dismissed him as a ruler whose primary weapon was unusable. His brother had spent decades arguing that a king who would not speak was a king who had abdicated his role. These dismissals had the same structure. They looked at the silence, and they saw its most obvious quality, which is the absence of something. They did not see the presence that the absence made room for. The silence was never absence. It was preparation. It was the sustained condition of a mind that had learned, through decades of practice in a very specific set of constraints, to be completely present in every room without announcing the presence. He noticed things that speaking people miss, because speaking and noticing occupy the same attention, and he had always put his full attention into noticing. He held positions that arguing people cannot hold, because argument requires the speaker to commit publicly to a position before they are fully certain of it, and he was never required to commit publicly. He made choices in the complete quiet of a process that no one else had access to, and he made them carefully, and when he made them, they were finished in a way that choices arrived at through the friction of discussion are rarely finished. He was also a father. This is the part of his life that the history of Attilan tends to receive most quietly, partly because the formal record of inhuman kingship does not have a clear category for it, and partly because he had no public way to speak it. He had a son. He had put his son in a room. He had visited the room. He had stood in corridors outside rooms, in the cold of late-night palace halls, carrying in his silence the love that a voice would have made audible, and that the silence kept inside him with everything else he could not release. The decision he made in the throne room, to open his mouth, to let out the sound, knowing that Ahura was in the lower levels and the evacuation was not complete, was not the decision of a man who had stopped loving his son. It was the decision of a man who had spent 34 years making the calculation about when the cost was worth the action, and who had concluded in the specific circumstances of October in a stone room above a harbour that the cost was worth it. The calculation was not wrong. The cost was real. Both things are true, and the truth of both of them together is the whole thing. Not a contradiction to be resolved, but a tension to be held. The way he had always held everything, plainly, without looking away. He was the king who wouldn't speak. He saved the universe by speaking once. These two sentences contain the full irony, in its shortest form, and they have been visible as the destination since the beginning of the account. What the account has tried to give them is the weight they require. 34 years of daily discipline, of renewed choice, of the specific cost of holding a power that is only valuable if it is not used, until the moment when not using it is no longer the right choice. The irony is not clever. It is not a twist. It is the logical end of a life organized around a specific principle, arriving at the moment when the principle requires the exception, and the exception is permanent. What he built with the silence across all those years was exactly what had to be in place for the exception to mean something. The network, the relationships, the precise vocabulary of his governance, the trust of the people around him, all of it was the structure that made the single moment of speaking the most significant thing it could be rather than just an act of violence in a room. If he had spoken freely, his voice would have been one more powerful voice in a world full of them. Because he had not spoken, when he did speak, it remade the conditions of the world. This is the thing the Kree had feared and had not understood they were fearing. They had predicted that their creation would be instrumental in the Kree Empire's end. They had predicted power. They had not predicted discipline. The power was easy to foresee. They had built it, they could measure it, they could run the models and see the destruction it implied. The discipline was not a product of their design. The discipline was what Blackagar Boltagon had chosen, in a sealed room, at age 6, when the alternative was a world that could not receive what he had to give. The discipline was the part of him that had not been made by the Kree. The Terrigen cloud moved through the world's atmosphere for months, dispersed by wind and weather into concentrations that were lower than the initial detonation, but still sufficient, in the thousands of human bodies that contained the relevant genetic signature, to trigger the transformation it was designed to trigger. It is still moving, in some form, somewhere. The inhuman diaspora that resulted from Attilan's fall is still in the process of becoming what it is going to become. The new humans are still finding each other, still building the community that did not have a shape when it started, still negotiating the relationship between what they were before the cloud found them and what they are after. New Attilan floats in the Hudson River as this is written. The city that fell has been partially recovered, in the specific sense that cities recover from catastrophic events, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific texture of a place that remembers what it was while being something new. The Genetics Council is less dominant than it was. Medusa's voice is more present in the governance than it was in the formal Attilan period. The hierarchy is less rigid. Whether this constitutes improvement or merely change depends on who you ask, which is the permanent condition of any assessment of any change to a social structure that was there before you and will be there after you. He's still there too, in the accounts that document the ongoing story of the Inhumans. Still silent, in the sense that he has not amended the discipline that has defined his reign. The discipline remains. The choice to maintain it continues to be renewed, in the specific way that it has always been renewed. Not as a rule imposed from outside, but as a decision made internally, by a man who knows what he has, and has given a great deal of thought to when it should and should not be used. He has spoken once. He will make the calculation again and again for as long as the world requires it, and he will make it the same way he has always made it, quietly, completely, in the sustained practice of a man who learned very early that the most important things cannot be said. The evening comes. The light on the river is the same quality of late light that fell across the throne room floor on the October evening when Attilan ended and the world changed. It is not the same room. It is not the same city. The light does not know the difference. It falls across the water and the water holds it for a moment, briefly gold, briefly still, and then the wind moves and the surface changes and the light is somewhere else, and the moment that was holding it is already part of the record, already filed in the long silent archive of everything that has been and cannot be unsaid. The king sits in the quiet. The Terrigen drifts. The new people in their new lives are becoming what the cloud made them, and somewhere in New Attilan, in a room that is better than the old room, that has windows this time, that has been built with the understanding that whoever is in it deserves to see out. A young man is growing up with his father's eyes and his grandfather's history in his cells, and the full complicated inheritance of everything that the silence was, and everything that breaking it cost. His name is Uhura. He is alive. And if you want to know what comes next for the oldest civilization on Earth, the people the Kree built and could not contain, the ones whose king spent a lifetime not speaking, and changed the world with a whisper, the story continues. It has always continued. It is the nature of old things to persist past the moments that were supposed to end them, and to become, in the persistence, something the people who tried to predict the ending did not predict. Sleep well. The silence holds everything. It always has. If you enjoyed this journey through the story of Black Bolt and the Inhumans, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. We're always curious about that. And if there is a corner of the Marvel universe you want us to explore next, leave it below. We will find it in the dark and bring it back slowly, the way all the best stories are told.